in the last 75 years, so have the threats, unfortunately. Every time militaries advance, so too do their adversaries. And so the question is whether NATO can adapt, whether NATO's members and its allied partners can adapt and keep up with the rate of pace of change of all these advances that we're seeing, whether it is artificial intelligence, whether it's quantum computing, biotechnology, space weaponry. Well, the good thing is we are going to get into all of those topics today over the course of the next couple of hours, and we have some terrific guests to do that with us. I'd like to thank our partners. They have helped us put together this event, and they are the Council of Strategic Risks, Lockheed Martin, Microsoft, and the NATO Innovation Fund. Really, thank you for your support and for allowing us to convene a set of what I think will be very important conversations to set us up for the week ahead. For those of you in the room, you will find a number of things on your seat. There's a QR code with links to the day's agenda, speaker bios, so you can read up on who's coming up on stage. You also have a copy of the latest issue of Foreign Policy. This one is titled Europe Alone, and the premise really is that if you imagine a world in which America retrenches a little bit, no matter which way the election in November turns out, how does Europe think about its future without America's embrace? It's an important question for Europe to grapple with. Many of the leaders here this week are grappling with it already, irrespective of the outcome of the election. And we have 10 fantastic thinkers address that. I urge you to read it. Two other things. There's also a postcard on your table. That's with a link to analysis produced by FP Analytics, our independent research division, and that looks at how countries across the Indo-Pacific are responding to great power competition between the US and China. Fascinating topic. They've done some great new research on that. And then finally, there's a new report out this week, again from my partners at FP Analytics, and this one's called Defend, Attribute, Punish, and it's about deterring cyber warfare in the age of artificial intelligence. It's produced in partnership with Microsoft on the issues, and one of the contributors there is Anne Neuberger on the National Security Council. She's written a great essay. She will be on stage, I think, in about an hour or so, sharing her thoughts. So, last thing, there are many of you in the audience who have already asked questions. We have a team at the back that is compiling them and feeding them to the moderators. We're not going to take live audience questions. You can still ask questions. Again, use the QR code and you can find the Ask a Question button. If you're online, obviously, you're already there. That is it from me now. Again, thank you for being here and enjoy the discussions to come. Cheers.
Please welcome to the stage U.S. Department of Defense Chief Digital and Artificial Intelligence Officer, Dr. Radha Iyengar-Plum, for a conversation with FP's global technology reporter, Rishi Iyengar, on a new era of defense technology.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Hopefully, you've had or are having lunch. And thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Plum. It's great to have you here. To start off, it's been, I guess, exactly 3 months for you as the Pentagon's Chief Digital and Artificial Intelligence Officer. Can you talk about what that entails in practice? How is the military using AI, and what does overseeing that mean?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for having me here. The Chief Digital and AI Office, CDAO, really has a sort of 3 core functions. The first is to enable the department's ability to adopt digital and AI technology, and that includes things like policies and standards to do work, but it also includes translating those policies and rule sets into ways to actually do things. So concretely, we have, for instance, the Responsible AI Toolkit, which provides not just the philosophical principles of what it means to adhere to our ethical guidelines, but an actual toolkit to bounce your technology and potential digital tools against to actually make sure they comport with those rules and standards. Similarly, we don't just want to set up rules or ideas on how you will acquire and sustain digital technology. We have a TradeWinds acquisition ecosystem, which provides a streamlined process to get procurement of those types of digital technology into the department. So that's really the core enable function. But we also have the mission to build and sustain the underlying data and digital architecture that supports both analytics and AI adoption. So that means the technology data stacks, the analytics in everything from sort of boardroom sort of business functions, financial management, HR, healthcare, all the way through mission support. And we have forward deployed teams at each of the combatant commands to support those analytic priorities. And the third mission we have is to really help accelerate to speed adoption of new technology. And there we take an approach of targeted investments in areas we think there's real promise in digital and AI technology. The core area for there that's a big focus area for us is what we call advanced command and control capabilities. So these are things that integrate large amounts of data, put them in a usable interface that commanders can use to make tactical, strategic, and operational decisions, everything from force planning to how to execute a kill chain. So that's really the spectrum of what we're doing in CDAO.
Right. And in terms of as you said, there's on the one side, there's the use and integration of the data and kind of streamlining those more administrative parts of it. The second part, and the part that a lot of people are maybe concerned about, is integrating AI on the battlefield. Can you talk a little bit about that piece of it, and what are the things that you think about in terms of guardrails, in terms of how to actually do that?
Absolutely. Let me start with, you've heard it from the Secretary and Deputy Secretary in the department, but the department is strongly committed to ethical use of AI, including, but not limited to, ensuring humans are in the loop, so to speak, are involved in the decisions. People tend to focus AI on this target recognition and target execution piece. That's an important piece, and there's certainly technology innovations that can help us there. But it's important to remember AI has a whole host of relevant applications, many of which are mature and many of which can help with the force planning and execution. I'll use as a concrete example something that doesn't sound super battlefield oriented, but is predictive maintenance and logistics. Right? This is an area where AI technology is extremely helpful in ensuring that we have a ready and available fleet of resources that can take in large amounts of data from distributed sources and help optimize where we stop and maintain and refuel and refit our everything sea, land, air assets. That's a really important battlefield application, and we're also committed to making sure we're deploying those types of AI applications forward. To do that, we have, as I mentioned, this responsible AI toolkit that adheres to principles of how we want the ethical principles of our AI, but also rolls in a number of key risk management areas, security, cyber operations, so that you have a coherent, integrated roadmap for the key boundaries you want your AI tools to meet. And again, we bake that into this AI toolkit. We're now working to build what we call AI scaffolding, which is an enterprise-level environment that involves a development environment with appropriate compute, combined with labeled data that we focused on priority use cases, and baked in these test and evaluation and assurance tools so that you can go kind of end to end from development on labeled data, model development, model testing, all the way through the operational testing and evaluation to try to accelerate the development to fielding timelines.
So we're having this conversation on the eve of kind of the NATO summit here in Washington, D.C. Can you talk about that piece of it, everything you just spoke about how the U.S. is thinking about these issues? How does that work with allies and partners? How integrated is that? What are those conversations like?
Yeah, I'm going to start at the allies and partners levels and come back into NATO specifically. Look, it's no secret that AI is a big topic generally. It has been for several years. We're seeing a lot of accelerated advancements, things like generative AI model, autonomous vehicles. So there's a lot of attention on this. We have, for several years now, had the AI Partnership for Defense. That's about 17 countries really focused on how to foster AI adoption, interoperability, and those shared values. We work with those countries, but also very closely with NATO specifically on how we actually have digital transformation in a responsible way. So some concrete examples. We're part of NATO's Data and AI Review Board. That's where there's a concrete forum to share best practices in responsible AI and develop guidance and tools to inform NATO allies' kind of AI journey. We can do that together. We also led the development of the Responsible AI Assessment and Toolkit. That was based on our own Responsible AI Toolkit that I've just been talking about, and is really focused on how you can adopt and incorporate responsible AI principles and actually test those in the products throughout the AI tool's life cycle. Now, it's voluntary, but I think it's important to kind of have that as a concrete example of how we're looking to operationalize the shared values we have with allies and partners into real tools that accelerate deployment, but in a responsible way.
And the flip side of that, the other side of the coin, is, of course, adversaries. So when it comes to artificial intelligence, China's developing its own AI tools and applications. Russia is doing the same. How do you, first of all, are there conversations happening between the US and adversaries on that front? What do those look like? And how confident are you that there could be a baseline consensus on kind of safety and guardrails achieved?
I'll take that in two ways. Let me start with kind of the landscape. Everyone across allies, adversaries, competitors, everyone is looking to adopt AI. It has tremendous promise in a range of arenas, and that includes in sort of strategic military purposes. So China has made clear its intent to become a global leader in AI by 2030. Russia is looking at how it can incorporate these into things like autonomous warfare systems as well as cyber operations. Even Iran has incorporated AI into the use of its unmanned vehicles, and North Korea is looking at options even within their own limited resources, right? So you're really seeing a full landscape of adoption above and beyond what we're doing in the US. There are, of course, ongoing conversations with both allies and partners and strategic competitors through the range of normal forums we use. But ultimately, I think the value proposition of the American approach is one that that is based on the shared values of these ethical principles of AI adoption, the ways in which we approach things like data security, data privacy, intellectual property rights, along with the guidelines and guardrails that bound AI use that are really laid out in these responsible AI principles: ethical use, transparency, traceability, and then incorporated into these toolkits. And to my mind, kind of building that value proposition as a shared global proposition is sort of the work of the coming months and years.
Right. And to just follow up on that real quick, to what extent can you sort of trust that the adversaries will play by the same kind of rules and baselines?
Look, I don't think there is a silver bullet here that's going to help us ensure everyone adheres to the same guidelines and guardrails. There isn't in this technology area or in any technology area we have, especially in these sort of national security and defense arena, right? So AI is not unique or particularly noteworthy in that. What AI is emergent in a period of time where there is an international order, where there's a real case to be made for the values that underlie how we use and adopt that technology. And that's where I think the US and our allies in NATO are really working to lay out explicitly what are those value propositions, what does ethical use mean, what do we mean when we're ensuring that we have human decision makers, how does that translate into how you're looking at the tools, and how do we enable both that responsible adoption and responsible risk-taking to accelerate adoption while still being governed and bounded by those values and principles.
Right. So I want to ask about another piece of this, the dynamic with AI, which is that a lot of the development is being led by the private sector, which is maybe a departure from how the military acquired technology in the past. Can you talk about that shift a little bit in the relationship with the private sector?
Yeah. So look, I think it's a feature, not a bug, that the pointy end of the spear on innovation, so to speak, is happening in the American private sector. We have ideas-based economy, and we have the type of private capital structure that incentivizes that type of innovation and investment. So when you look at the dollars of private capital, even compared to government dollars, there's an order of magnitude difference. And that's an important thing to recognize in terms of the drivers of American innovation. So inside government, what we need to do is bluntly be less hard to work with, right? We need to be clear on what our requirements are, translate that into a meaningful demand signal. And by that, I mean, like, what is the procurement process? What is the timeline? What are the dollars associated with it? How are we going to buy it? And who's going to sustain it? Marching our way through that to make both transparent to industry where are the capability gaps, and let's identify the technology solutions in a marketplace that might meet those technology gaps or capability gaps, and then translate that through the acquisition process into the department. That's the work we're really focused on now. In CDAO, we focus that in the data and digital applications environment through this construct we're calling Open Dagger, which is focused on having a data and application government-owned but interoperable repository that covers both our data infrastructure but also our enterprise-level purchases on applications, so enterprise licenses, and then has a clear model to go out to industry, lay out our requirements, have a process to solicit solutions, have an experimentation series to test those solutions, and then, where appropriate, actually buy those solutions and incorporate that. And we're doing that through this Open Dagger process and an industry day that's just in a couple weeks.
Right. So you spent some time in Silicon Valley before this, and this is a question I like to ask everyone who's sort of at this intersection. But what is the biggest thing or biggest couple of things that you think Silicon Valley and that ecosystem and Washington and this ecosystem that you're now a part of get wrong about each other?
I think on the Silicon Valley side, there is a focus on speed and risk-taking that is absolutely appropriate for the private sector. And that's not reckless and that's not wrong, but it is very different than in the government. Inside the government, we have the responsibility and no-fail mission in the Department of Defense on supporting our warfighters, but we also have a responsibility for stewardship of taxpayer dollars and sort of responsible management of that technology. And so some of the slowness, some of the what people call bureaucracy is there to create just that, right? And so I think there's a healthy tension between the models. I think what folks get wrong is that just when the two different communities are speaking different language, that there are fundamental disagreements. I don't think anyone in the, I will say, for instance, acquisition system or DoD enterprise doesn't feel like there are things that can help us move faster, bring technology in more quickly. We have authorities and we can figure out how to use those processes better, absolutely. But ultimately, I think there is a need and a desire to have a much more ongoing conversation. In CDAO, we just signed a memorandum of agreement with DIU to try to create a clear front door to come in and talk to us about that department's enterprise level requirements for this. It can't be a one-off conversation where you sit across the table, talk at each other, and then see each other again in 2 years. It has to be an ongoing dialogue, and I think that's where the translation and understanding will really come from.
Well, a lot to unpack there, and we could keep talking, but unfortunately, that's all the time we have. Dr. Plum, thank you so much, and thank you, everyone, for being here.
And now, please welcome to the stage NATO's Deputy Supreme Allied Commander Transformation General, Chris Padilla, for a conversation with FP's diplomacy and national security reporter, Robbie Grammer, on responsible tech and coordinated defense.
Well, thanks so much, General, for coming. We've got a tight schedule and a lot to get through, so I'll dive in. To start, NATO Allied Command Transformation leads the adaptation militarily of the alliance. I'm wondering how that adaptation has changed since Russia first launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine back in February 2022.
First of all, thank you much. Hello, everyone. Thank you much for having me. How does it change overall? Of course, it changed, but what you all have to understand is what Allied Command Transformation is doing. We look at mid and long term. And we do it through a strategic foresight analysis. So we look out into the world and see what are the main drivers and changes overall, and then we come back and do some adaptations with that. So of course, you could say then we check and balance on are we going into the right direction? Because as we know, getting new capabilities takes normally between 7 and 10 years. So you really have to think in advance how you do that. Of course, what we're seeing now with the war on Ukraine, when it comes to the domains of space, when it comes to the domain of cyber, when it comes to unmanned, those are all things. But not only this, at the same thing, we all know when we go back 2 years ago, everybody thought this is a quick war and it should most probably it will end pretty soon. Now we are more than 2 years into the war. This is something for lessons identified as well when it comes to sustainment and enablement for NATO in itself. So there are so many lessons you still identify and you learn from that, and you still balance it with what we are planning and how we go forward. And that's with our main job, what we are doing.
And there, we were talking before this panel, it sounds like there's this tension between the new tech and the old tech. We need to focus on these things like AI, like cyber, like drone warfare, what that means. But at the same time, what Ukraine needs right now is a lot of old tech. It's artillery shells, it's HIMARS rocket systems, which were of course developed in the early 1990s. So how do you think about this, the marriage of this new and old tech when we're looking at a war like the war in Ukraine? And is there any sort of inherent tension or debate going on within NATO on how to marry these two?
Of course it is. Just as to give you a broad figure, about 80% of what we have in inventory, you might call it legacy systems, this is what you have. And those date sometimes back to the 1960s. So really what the challenge is, how do you enable fielded systems that are already quite aging, but still worthwhile keeping along? And how do you, through AI, for instance, how do you enable all those systems really being top-notch and going forward when it comes to providing the situational awareness, exactly knowing where you are in space and time dimensions with all those things, and at the same time now looking into new technology? Because the challenge we are always having is, and this is what I always explain to people, you have to be very careful not preparing for the war of yesterday. Because if you just buy tanks, if you just buy more of the ones you have already, this will not do the job. So you have to look into that very, very sensitive, how you're going to do that. Just in broad terms, how do we plan for a conflict in the future? We do that in 5 domains. It's air, land, sea, which is pretty classic, but it's cyber and space. And still tends that cyber and space are not at the level it should be in order to be brought forward. Everybody feels pretty comfortable. And if you look nowadays, everybody tells you how much more tanks they're buying, how much more aircraft they're buying. Don't get me wrong, F-35, for instance, is newest, best technology you can get, but still it's the same of something. So, but how do you enable, how do you get more advantage out of it? And it comes to space and cyber, and this is what we have to look for.
So, I mean, answer your own question that you posed there. I mean, how are you thinking about space and cyber and what that means for the alliance? What type of systems does the alliance need to invest in long term to shore up support there?
I will explain it in a little bit of a different way. The way we approach that is, I always like to explain it in, you have to have dominance in 3 major steps. First of all, you need to have an information dominance. If you have information dominance, then you get into the decision dominance, and once you have that, then you have engagement dominance overall. So really the first question is, what do you need for new technology when you go into information dominance? And then it comes automatically, it comes into space and it comes into cyber. So with all the systems you have out there, how do you take that, how do you take advantage over whatever enemy or peer competitor might be out there? So especially when it comes to communications, when it comes to reconnaissance aspects, all those things. And it's not only that. Nowadays, if you look into space, it's not about new space infrastructure. It's the question is, how do you use what's already out there? So the dual use aspect to that. It's assured access to space and it's data security. This is what we are after. This is what you have to invest. And this is where we need to come to closer a lot more and cooperate much more. So those are the systems we're looking for.
Is NATO investing enough in that at the rate it should be at this point?
I have to make one point here that everybody understands. NATO is nations. We are 32 sovereign nations. NATO is setting the standards. NATO is setting the outline. Just for the audience, 95% of the capabilities NATO has is provided by nations. 5% is common funded. So this is over and above. There are certain things like C2 systems, surveillance systems of common interest, and which are at the same time very expensive. This is what you get. So what we are doing is basically we are planning, we are looking into the future. We are in very, very close contact with our nations when it comes to the defense planning process overall, how we target our nations and what capabilities are needed. And then it's a sovereign decision what they are getting, but they know exactly where we're looking from a targeting point of view, what capabilities are needed.
Well, then, to rephrase my question a bit, are NATO nations investing enough, in your view, in these two realms?
The answer is twofold. We all know over the past 20 to 30 years, there was an underinvestment throughout. So that answer number one is right now, whatever you invest in, it's good invested money because we need more. This is what you've heard now with the new defense plans we have coming. With a new defense posture, especially when you look towards Europe, there is a lot more needed, and it doesn't matter if it's defensive nature, if it's offensive nature, if it's reconnaissance nature, if it's C2, wherever you want to go, do it, and you invest into the right things.
You know, you mentioned the new defense plans. I think that's one of the most important, if sort of wonkiest and most obscure takeaways from this summit we're seeing this week. It doesn't get a lot of press coverage. It does in Foreign Policy Magazine, but not elsewhere. Can you talk a bit about that to the audience and just underscore the importance of these new defense plans, what they are, why they matter to the alliance, why they matter for military adaptation?
From the past we were coming, it was NATO in total, we always had this 360-degree approach. We said we need to defend, but it was not very specific. It was overall, and if something would happen, then we would decide and then we would plan against it. This has changed, of course, also with but before already the war in Ukraine, because we saw the tensions rising. And you all know, and especially this audience know, it's not only Russia. It's if you go down from Iraq to Syria, if you go North Korea, wherever you go, all your conflict vectors and threat vectors are upwards. There is none going sideways or down. So this is what you need to prepare for, and this is what we're looking at when we look at the challenges overall. So we took this, and then we said, well, we need to defend now already in a much more dedicated way, if you will. So this is why for Europe, there we have now 3 regional plans. There is a southern one, a central one, and a northern one. And then you have the capabilities you need within that, but the main difference nowadays is now you have dedicated forces already to a certain area. So the forces know each other, you know exactly how you sustain, how you cooperate. So there is a much more detailed plan now. This is the new quality, if you will. And from that new quality, of course, you know, if you look at the possible threat, of course, from a European perspective, if you look, it's definitely Russia. You know what they have. And with that, of course, there's an increase, and I said it before, when it comes to defensive setups, when it comes to offensive, be it deep precision strike, be it integrated air and missile defense, be it ballistic missile defense. So in all those areas, with the plans, new capabilities, more capabilities, plus enablement and sustainment. And don't get me wrong on that one, at the same time, and you might have heard that, a new conflict, it will be big in scale and in mass and in hard power. This is what you need, and you need it sustained. And this is what those new plans are. This is what we plan against it. My command, we go with the capability of planning against it, and this is how we are right now negotiating with the nations what we get.
I mean, you talked about these decades of underinvestment that both sides of the Atlantic are now waking up to and renewing investment. Is that investment happening quick enough? Is Europe rearming quick enough to be able to continue supplying Ukraine in the long haul?
I would say as fast as we can, now realizing that, of course, the past 20 years, There have been things not being done the way they should have been done. You know, I mean, you're right on that. You know, now it's we are now 2024. There are 23 nations now above the 2%. That's quite a success story. If you just see in this year, it's European NATO nations plus Canada. The increase in defense spending in this year is 18% plus. There you see the money is there, but at the same time, and this is also why this summit is so important when it comes to cooperation with the defense industry. There are a lot of discussions ongoing and side talks as well with that, because we also call it, it's at the same time, if you will, it's a war on warehouses, if you will, and you also deter by warehouses because, you know, just in time, delivery just in time, production just in time will not do it. Because we see if you have a prolonged war, you need to have enough capacity and capability in order to do that. How do you do that? You have to have long-term contracts. So it's not only that the money is there, that we have the turnaround, which is everything is very, very good, but now the defense industry needs to come with it. And the last point, ladies and gentlemen, this is not something that just is of interest for the military. It's a whole of society approach to it. And this is also what Ukraine shows us. This is what the new two partners or allies shows us, Sweden and Finland, for instance. They have a total defense concept. If you see how you want to defend your country if you're by yourself, it's a whole of society approach. And as you all have heard that, you know, the army might win the battle, the nation wins the war. And this is where we need to go back to.
I mean, Congressman McCall was up here on the stage a while back, and he was sounding alarm bells on how the American defense industrial base was under so much strain right now. Have to deal with the Indo-Pacific, have to deal with the war in Ukraine, obviously the war in the Middle East. How under strain is the defense industrial base across the alliance in your mind, and how does that factor into some of the planning that you're doing down at ACT?
Well, what it is at the end of the day is, you know, everything was leaner. It was faster, and it was, you know, you have wherever you could save. This is when we think, and that's a lesson identified and lesson learned, it's all about resilience. And you have to get back to that. And if you come back, if you have a contract, you have like 10 or 15, 20-year contracts with companies, and they have to have a clear signal, a demand signal that they can produce and that they will be there and that they get money. Because as we all know, if a single spare part is missing and they're not producing it anymore, you cannot operate your weapon system. So the whole market needs to turn. The thing is, the understanding is there, and coming back to your question from before, you don't change it overnight. And this is where we need to come back to, and hopefully, that's sometimes, you know, people tend to forget, in 2 years' time, if maybe tensions are not that high anymore, I don't think that this is the case, but still, then people tend to forget, and then we are back into the old system. And this must not happen again.
So in short, it's not just the investment of the money, but it's how you spend it.
Absolutely.
We've just got a couple more minutes here. I wanted to offer you any final thoughts before we get off stage.
Yeah, well, what are our final thoughts? You know, the thing is, we think a lot about it. What is the conflict of the future? And I just want to give you one thought with that. From where we are today, the way we think today, and the way we think crisis and conflict will happen, this will not be the case in the future. And I give you just one example. When I talk to army officers and I ask them, what's the main battle system you're having? Normally you get the answer, it's the main battle tank. I tell you, in 20 years' time, it's definitely not the main battle tank anymore. Because if you have a digitalization of the battlefield, if everything is detected, you cannot camouflage anymore, you cannot hide anymore. It's more the 300 to 400 mile system that will hit you, and you not even don't know what's happening there. So we really need to adapt fast. We need to go into a new direction. This is something I always would like to offer, and think about space and cyber. This is the most important thing right now. Think about 5 domains, but more focus on space and cyber, and then incorporate the new technology with the existing technology in order to maintain the advantage we have.
General, thank you so much. Really
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Please now welcome to the stage the Chairman, President, and CEO of Lockheed Martin Corporation, Jim Taiclet, for a conversation with FP's publisher and CEO, Andrew Solinger, on strengthening global deterrence through greater connectivity.
Just over here, Jim. We'll come right over here. Great. Hey, everyone. So very honored and excited to have Jim Taiclet of Lockheed Martin joining us this afternoon. We didn't really make a big deal about that earlier on because security and all that sort of thing, but really excited that you were able to join us. And it's probably hard for you to recognize where you are actually at all times. So we're glad that you were able to join us. We're going to talk about this perilous moment in global security that we're in right now. It's very clear that we need to make sure our industrial base is more innovative, resilient, and collaborative going forward. So these are some of the things that we want to talk about with Jim today. We're going to discuss about how we can integrate new technologies, enhance resilience, dependability of supply chains and the like, and partnerships, how those are important and how that can impact global security. Sound good?
That sounds great.
Great.
Okay.
So a quote I read today, just to get into the innovative defense industry and the importance of that, it being enhanced. The quote went like this: "Defense will always be a hardware and software game. Increasingly, it will be hardware-enabled, but software-defined, and software will absorb a lot of the capability and complexity." What do you agree, disagree? What do you think of that?
I agree with the concept, right? Which is you've got to have hardware and software at the leading edge of technology to maintain your advantage and an effective deterrent. My hypothesis, though, at the largest scale, is that the U.S. Department of Defense needs systemic change to be able to deliver on that promise. And by systemic change, I mean that we've got to really run the national defense enterprise a lot more like commercial tech and telecom industry works, which is to create an open architecture, standards-based system where all the players, because we need all of U.S. industry and all of allied industry, frankly, to participate on this. And that's everything from a startup in someone's garage in Palo Alto all the way up to, say, Lockheed Martin or Boeing or Northrop Grumman. All those companies and everybody in between, including some of the partners we have built relationships with that are strategic. Microsoft for distributed cloud computing and a classified cloud where we have the only one in the country, where we can do work across different locations on a cloud-based system that Microsoft and our company put together. You need to have the ability to do those kinds of things with these partners because you need a Microsoft to scale the cloud. You need a Verizon to work on 5G networking levels between satellite, ground, and hybrid base stations, for example. You need NVIDIA, which is another partner of ours, to help build digital twins in a way that we can be much more effective with AI, for example. So we really want to bring all of industry into this sort of new approach, which is a mission-based approach, right? So what I mean by that, Andrew, is every defense platform, say ship, satellite, aircraft, et cetera, it's going to have its technology roadmap or a modernization plan to make that piece of equipment more capable as time goes on. But what we really need to do is turn the whole system on its side and look at the mission lens through why do I need that aircraft? What do I need that satellite for? What's the mission I'm trying to accomplish? Because where the software and the AI and the digital technologies will really advantage us is in getting the missions done by combining data flows, communication links, and AI to make all of those platforms much more effective. So that's really where this needs to go.
Okay, that makes sense. The mission seems to have been changing, though, also on the battlefield, I guess. I'm curious what lessons you've learned and we've learned from the rapid deployment of defense systems in Ukraine. And how are these developments informing your future innovations? And I might add, and for those who are watching at home, we have a piece that we published just yesterday, and it's called How Ukraine's Drone Industry Took Flight. And basically, there's a group of a few hundred innovative startups that are right now in Ukraine developing small garage startups that are developing their own systems and sending them out into the battlefield. And they're learning a tremendous amount. This is how they're combating Russian mass production. Just curious what the learnings are for Lockheed, how you're applying this.
So the Ukrainian drone industry, which is organically being created, necessity is the mother of invention, it is said. They've invented an industry on the fly to defend their country in real time. Some of the lessons from that, and something we've been advocating pretty heavily for and still haven't kind of gotten it through yet, is a parallel acquisition path for our Department of Defense that is much faster than the traditional acquisition path, not to replace the acquisition system, but to be adjacent to it. We're not going to try to, I don't think it'd be a valuable use of energy to try to change the large acquisition, DoD acquisition system. Right. It's embedded, it's actually successful for building and fielding these big platforms at scale, so maybe everything could be improved a little bit, but let's leave that aside. What we need is a parallel acquisition path for digital services, right? And a digital service would be the network of, and this is fascinating, I find, because I used to be in the telecom network business myself. There are cell phones taped to cell towers in Ukraine, and they're just on listening for aircraft coming by or missiles coming by. And those are all networked into a solution for a commander to say, there are 50 Russian drones coming at you based on the sound waves that were picked up by these cell phones that are taped to these towers. So we should have an acquisition path where if somebody comes up with an idea like that and presents it to the Department of Defense, that we can scale it and have hundreds or thousands of those deployed in Europe, deployed in Middle East, deployed in South China Sea in 6 months. Our acquisition system wouldn't kind of enable that. We need an acquisition system that's faster, is less requirements-based, but more capability-based to get these kind of software-based services, these digital services in place.
Can you talk a little bit about 5G.mil, which is a program that you're championing at Lockheed? And some folks here may know about it, but a brief descriptor of what it is and how it matters in this exact context that you're describing.
So I'll describe this in terms of the telecom industry, right? So you can buy a phone in Washington, D.C., use it in Seoul, Korea, and it's just like nothing ever happened. It's automatic, right? That system works that way because there's a standard set of interfaces, frequencies that are being used, APIs that are common, error correction methodologies and algorithms that are cross-licensed among various industry players. And if you can design your phone, or you can design your core network base station, or you can design your antenna to meet those standards, you can go onto the network, or you can sell into the consumer base, and that device will work on any network. Yeah. We need to have that in the national defense enterprise, because whether Lockheed Martin built something in 1985 or Northrop Grumman built something in 2015, we should be able to interface those two platforms, right? We should be able to interface that to something that we're putting together now, Joint Fires Network and Indo-PACOM. So you have to have these interfaces and these frequencies, these standards buys in a set. In the telecom industry and in the commercial side, we call that 3GPP. And it's the platform and the body of experts, engineers and scientists and business people that get together in rooms like this and fight out who has the best technology, decide which ones that we're all going to use, and then we can go back to our workshops and build off of those standards. 5G.mil is the brand I came up with for that, for the Department of Defense. We should have that. Now, the first, inklings and the first movement towards that between government, because government has to convene this, right, but it shouldn't run it. Industry should be there, and that's, again, small startups, tech companies, telecom companies, and defense primes. All ought to be in that room setting those standards with their engineers. And then again, we all run out, and the next item I build and the retrofit I do on my aircraft, my F-16, for example, will fit into the 5G.mil standard set and will connect to a satellite that Boeing made. And that's where we need to go. So 5G.mil, or something like it, is the standards body in open architecture. The acquisition path is the other tangible thing we need that government and industry both have to play on to get this done. So we already have our goal. The goal is a national defense strategy. National security strategy says no matter what domain you're in, air, space, sea, undersea, land, et cetera, no matter what service you're in, Army, Navy, Air Force, no matter what allied partner you are, UK, France, Poland, Japan, you'll be able to work together with all of your systems and all your equipment and all your comm gear, and we can fight together. And that is what we're trying to implement with 5G.mil.
Outstanding. That sounds like bringing a lot of people together to get in the same direction there, of course, as well. But it sounds like a very interesting strategy. Let's talk a little bit about industry resilience and anti-fragility. We've talked a lot in past about supply chain issues. How can we have a dependable supply chains and growth? Maybe you could talk a little bit about how Lockheed Martin is growing stronger in the face of those challenges, what you're trying to do to make sure the industrial base can withstand economic and geopolitical headwinds going forward.
So similar to the technology path that we just talked about, we're trying to use our company as the pathfinder to show how this can be done. So just a quick aside, we have 4 business areas, we call them, or divisions. They were semi-independent, in years past. But to implement the national defense strategy, we actually had to work together better internally first, because we have divisions that build satellites, sonar rigs for undersea, aircraft, of course,
right.
Lower domain aircraft, which are helicopters. And we needed to tie all those products together and deliver better on missions using digital technology. So we're doing that on the technical side. On the resilience side, I have advocated in my company and now externally. There's a book by Nassim Taleb, who wrote The Black Swan. He also wrote a book called Anti-Fragility, which is a point you just made. Anti-fragility means you can design a system that when it's disrupted or interrupted does not fail or catastrophically degrade, right? So how do you keep something strong by design and not wait till something adverse happens to be able to respond to that? So when it comes to defense production, there's some pretty straightforward things the government and industry can do together to build resiliency. One is, and these sound simple, but we have to get them through the acquisition system, and Congress has to approve the funding for these things.
Right.
Which is, I don't know if it's 5 or 10% of the entire budget, but for that 5 or 10% investment, you could get much better resiliency, and you could get much better scalability. And the kinds of things that I'm describing here are buying long lead time parts, for example. So if you go back in the supply chain 4 or 5 steps, we need an order 2 years from now for a microchip to put into an aircraft. Well, why don't we buy 2 years worth of that now? And then if there's ever an interruption like COVID in the supply chain, or one of our sources goes out of business, or the Chinese quit exporting something that we need, that we've at least got a year or 2 of stocks to keep the production line running. That's one relatively easy one. The second one is multi-year procurements. So for large aircraft like F-35 or Black Hawk, there have been 2 or 3 year multi-year procurements. But what the technology industry does is they run on a subscription business model, Andrew, which means, so for example, using the example of cell towers, which you have a cell tower, there's 2 or 3, if you drive by these things, they have 2 or 3 platforms of equipment on it. Each of those is a wireless carrier, Verizon, Sprint, T-Mobile, something, that is transmitting off that site. Well, to build a new site, I need a 10-year lease from you, and then I'll go finance it on Wall Street and I'll go build a site. That's a 10-year subscription. You sign up for a subscription for your cell phone for a year. That's the receiving end of this network. And yeah, unless you sign up for a 1 or 2 year subscription, you're going to pay a higher price, for example. So the way the tech industry does things is they essentially lock you into a long-term agreement. You're going to pay every month or every year, and that's how they continue to upgrade the software and the hardware as you go.
Right.
The Department of Defense tends to buy things with, it's like buying a used car in a car lot. You drive the car away, you sign a title, we call it a DD-250, and now you own that thing. And now you've got to, if you want a better engine in that, you're going to have to go pay for it later, right? So instead of the subscription model where the OEM or the network operator is continuously upgrading their entire system for the mission they're doing, which is providing you mobile internet, you're back and forth with industry, it's clunky, and you don't have continuous improvement, frankly. And that's one of the other things that we need to do.
Okay, that makes sense. I'm in the subscription business, by the way, so I need to go for those longer-term deals. I like your thinking.
That's right. You know what I'm talking about.
So let's talk about, we promised we talk about global partnerships also. So critical to this, and actually it leads back to supply chains. How can, and how does Lockheed Martin deepen its collaboration with international allies and partners, expanding supply chain accessibility and enhancing delivery of key systems? I mean, we are here, after all, at the NATO summit this week, and this is a key element of, I'm sure, some of the discussions that you'll be having this week later.
Yeah, this is really critical to both things. First of all, the technology insertion. There's really good technology in places like Europe and Japan, Taiwan as well. We ought to be able to leverage those. And also on the physical side, there are trained labor forces. There are factory capacity available in various countries of our allies, for example. And so to add to the anti-fragility, you can distribute your production and sustainment operation around the world. So if you have a pandemic in one country and it doesn't affect another country, you're still producing, for example, right? So this internationalization will help. Now, most of the big aerospace companies are doing this at some level. But what we've done, again, is we kind of turned the whole company on its side and said, look, normally we have offset requirements, right? So we sell, 40 F-35s to a country. They want $1 billion worth of industrial participation. And offset is like a pain to figure out, and it's just something you have to do. And I said, no, you know what we should do? We should have a Lockheed Martin, and maybe every other company will do something like this, a deliberate plan for global production operations and sustainment in the places where our customers are and where our U.S. forces are deployed. And that is Asia and that is Europe. Right. And that's something we're deliberately doing. A couple partnerships I can mention, because I know we're short on time, is with Rheinmetall in Germany. We are building a HIMARS in Germany, calling it GMARS with them. That's one example. And also in Poland, with one of the government-controlled industries there, we're building Javelin missiles. So we have our own JV with Raytheon to build Javelin missiles. We're also incorporating now this Polish company to build them in Poland.
And I would imagine that'll make service easier also on some of these systems as well. You're a lot closer to your market.
That's exactly right. I mean, you need to get things fixed, as you say. You don't have to ship them all the way across to the United States and back. And if you're in a contested logistics environment, which is what the national security strategy says we're going to be in, you don't want to have to do that. You want to have sustainment or repair operations right where you're using the equipment. And we actually have a small HIMARS repair station on the Polish border of Ukraine. And when the Ukrainian HIMARS get damaged, battle damage, which they have, and I've seen when I visited there, you can actually just drive them across the border, put them on a train car, and get them fixed and drive them back.
That makes a lot of sense. Faster into market and in the battlefront where they're needed. Right. I know we could go on forever, but I think we really touched on all the key points here. We wanted to talk about integrating digital technologies. We talked about 5G.mil, enhancing industry resilience and anti-fragility, and about global partnerships as well. And it's great to hear that you're having some of those on-the-ground operations that will help support those partners. Jim Taiclet, CEO of Lockheed Martin, thank you so much for joining us today.
Glad to, Andrew. Thanks, everybody.
Next, please welcome U.S. Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber and Emerging Technology, Ann Neuberger, for a conversation with FP's Vice President of Research, Dr. Maisha Alam, on combating evolving cyber threats.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us here in person as well as to our global audience online. It is my distinct honor and privilege to have with us Ann Neuberger from the White House. She is the Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber and Emerging Technologies, and really at the helm of much of the U.S. government's response to all kinds of cyber threats. And so we're just so delighted that you are able to join us for this conversation. Thank you for being here.
It is wonderful to be here. Thank you.
Let's dive right in. We were just talking about this a little bit outside before we came on stage. In recent years, we've seen an uptick in nation-state-backed cyber attacks against critical infrastructure. Can you provide us, from your vantage point at the White House, with your assessment of the evolving threat landscape? What kinds of cyber attacks are you tracking? Who's behind them? What are their impacts? Help paint the picture for us.
Absolutely. So we've seen three trends come together. One is greater availability of offensive cyber tools and the infrastructure to deploy them. Two, a greater set of actors, countries and criminals willing to do so. And three, more and more critical infrastructure digitally connected and available, connected to the internet. So where that plays out with regard to specific threats is a wave of ransomware criminal attacks by individuals based in Russia against hospitals, against water systems, against companies in the US and around the world. One quick data snapshot. Attacks against hospitals in the US are up 130% in the last 6 months. Significant impact, leading to ambulances being turned away from hospitals, canceled medical services, the attack we saw against the UK's major blood bank last week, in the last few weeks as well. So that's one way it plays out. The second way that plays out is with regard to China pre-positioning in critical infrastructure in the United States, in a number of Indo-Pacific countries, we believe with the goal of disrupting those systems, a port, a power system in the event of a crisis or conflict. And finally, with regard to North Korea, conducting attacks against crypto infrastructure as its core way of gleaning funds to evade the really heavy sanctions. So those three factors of more connected infrastructure, more available offensive cyber tools, more parties willing to use them, are translating into just far more disruptions in critical infrastructure around the world.
Wow. Well, listening to you speak, a couple of things stand out to me in particular. The first being that the source of the threats is there's a diversity there, and it's important to recognize that. But the second, and especially as you were talking about hospitals, water systems, energy grids, these have very real impacts on people's lives. So when we talk about, cyber attacks, recognizing the destructive impacts and the destructive potential of those is so important. When boundaries in cyberspace are so easily crossed, what strategies and tools are required for effective cyber deterrence? How has the Biden administration worked with U.S. allies to shape international norms and to strengthen preparedness?
So as you said, cyberspace has no borders. So you have many different actors operating around the world. The infrastructure in one set of countries can be used by actors in another set of countries to attack countries in a third. So how we think about building deterrence in that environment is a complex question. And the common comment I often get is people will say, we need new norms. The reality is there's a set of international cyber norms which all UN member countries signed off on, first affirmed in 2015 and signed off on again in 2019. And they lay out really significant norms in the area of cyberspace. What we've been lacking is accountability, consequences for violating those norms. And where the Biden administration has done a lot of work is first building the international partnerships in a positive way, sharing information, capacity building in cyberspace, and I'll give a couple of examples, as well as working to form coalitions to help attribute as a first step to then imposing consequences for countries who violate those norms. So in the first case, in the case of international partnerships, what we've done is, I'll give one example. The White House launched something called the International Counter-Ransomware Initiative, recognizing that criminals, largely based in Russia, were the most significant source of disruptions of infrastructure around the world. We launched this in 2021 with 30 countries. It has grown to right now where it is 68 countries around the world, from Congo to Ghana to Nigeria to Singapore to Lithuania. And countries lead different lines of work, both sharing information, helping do trainings in regional areas, reaching out to countries who are undergoing an attack to help them recover. So that's been one way the Biden administration is focused on really raising all boats. Yeah. The second one has been consequences, and I'll give 2 examples there. One was, so the evening before Russia invaded Ukraine, Russia conducted a cyber attack against a commercial satellite company providing communication services to Ukraine. And we worked with our European partners to attribute that attack to Russia as a first step to say attacks on critical infrastructure violate those norms. Similarly, after Iran's attack on Albania's government infrastructure, we worked with a series of partners to again call that out, because the larger the community of countries attributing an attack, the more that then we hope will join together on the second phase, which is imposing consequences.
Your point on building a broad-based coalition is really well taken for a number of reasons. As you said, it's about lifting all boats, but the other thing we know, certainly from our research at FP Analytics, the Independent Research Division of Foreign Policy, is that oftentimes cyber attackers will, launch attacks in countries you might not expect, because they're trying to see, whether it works, right? It's an experiment to run, and then they'll scale up. So that point is really well taken, as is the point that you made about international norms. And it's not just norms, it's also about international law. And there's a growing consensus that international humanitarian law does apply when we think about cyber operations that affect critical infrastructure, when we think about the protection of civilians and so on and so forth. One of the things that we've been very privileged to have the opportunity is to collaborate with you and your team for a new report that we are launching today on cyber deterrence, looking at deterrence through denial and deterrence through punishment. And this is, for those of you who are in the room, you may see these flyers on the table. This is the 4th installment of a multi-year project we have called Digital Front Lines, looking at the risks of and responses to hybrid warfare. In your essay contribution to the installment which launches today, I'm just going to quote from it, if I may. You say, and I quote, "Adversaries understand that the United States will respond to cyber attacks that cause physical impacts, just as we would respond to a kinetic attack." That's a bold statement and a really important one. So what kinds of considerations go into calibrating a proportional and timely response when you're faced with cyber attacks and cyber operations? Can you share some examples of what that looks like in practice?
Absolutely. So first, thank you for inviting me to contribute. I really appreciate the analytics arm and the research work that you've been leading here. And a product like this that has both government and private sector perspectives is so important, because the private sector both owns and operates critical infrastructure around the world, and the visibility, major private firms, like I think you have a contribution from Microsoft have, there's a visibility via global sensors that gives a good picture. That's really key to that attribution. Attribution is one of the particularly hard parts of consequences in cyberspace. So to that point and to that example, you talk about deterrence by denial. One reason so many countries around the world, and the Biden administration notably, President Biden made a major shift, which is he shifted from voluntary cybersecurity standards for critical infrastructure to minimum mandates, to say, we know that there are attackers who want to disrupt pipelines, who want to disrupt airports and water systems. Citizens of a country expect those systems to be secure from those disruptions. So as government, for the first time, President Biden mandated minimum cybersecurity across a number of sectors of critical infrastructure. And frankly, those are the core questions when I engage with foreign partners. This morning, our colleagues in Italy came to visit. Mm-hmm. Their first question always is, where do we start? And we always say we start with having minimum cybersecurity across critical infrastructure, because we want to make it riskier, costlier, and harder for attackers, whether they're countries or criminals. The second part of that, then, is the international norms and consequences. Mm-hmm. And in order to do so, in the past, when we would go to countries to say, let's attribute this attack, often countries would spend a lot of time sending back and forth technical details, when really attribution is a political decision. Does a country want to call out another country, either privately or publicly, for a cyber attack that has occurred? And then if so, what are the consequences? And the first question we ask, to your point about consequences, is what would be step 2? If we, for example, respond with a cyber attack on a country who's attacked infrastructure in the US, our goal would be to signal this wasn't acceptable and to get them to stop. Our goal is not to continue to escalate. So how we meter what that response is to convey and signal that message is often the hardest question, and really an area for ongoing research and policy work.
That point about escalation is really important, and in this compendium that we're publishing today, we actually have a contribution from Senator James Patterson of Australia, who may or may not be in the room at the moment, and he also makes this point of, we have to make sure that we're avoiding a spiraling while ensuring that there's accountability as well. And indeed, there 300% increase in Russian cyber operations targeting NATO countries between 2020 and 2022. That's a really important data point to understand that constant barrage of attacks. And at the same time, 80% of all cyber infrastructure exists on private sector operated platforms. And so before we finish our conversation, we're here, on the eve of or alongside the NATO summit. I know you'll be having all kinds of important discussions and meetings and strategy sessions. So looking ahead, and as we think about what comes out of this summit, what, in your view, needs to change? For example, relating to attribution, to signaling, to international law. You've touched on these all a little bit, but what would you like to see going forward to increase that accountability and to reduce the escalation?
That's the core. That's the core and the best question is, how do we go from here? Here's the progress that's been made. How do we continue to work together in an international community to have a more secure cyberspace as our economies and our countries are more and more digitally connected? So I think the first piece is a big part of enforcing international norms is having a common way to attribute an attack. That's harder and harder as countries can use each other's covert infrastructure to launch attacks. So that's the first. What are the political standards that different countries need in order to have a common baseline for attribution? The second, what are appropriate consequences? And game playing and scenario playing, what are consequences that convey that message? Not of escalating, but of conveying that an attack in cyberspace is equivalent to an attack, a kinetic attack on critical infrastructure, and will be responded to, but in a way that, again, is non-escalatory, given more digitally connected countries are in many ways more vulnerable. And then the third is continuing to build on tighter and tighter international partnerships, like the International Counter-Ransomware Initiative, so more countries are more secure, critical infrastructure is more secure, and citizens can feel confident that they don't have to worry, is their water safe, is their power safe, even in the middle of a crisis or conflict.
That's so important indeed, especially as so many countries are looking towards that digital transformation and making sure that public services reach greater, portions of the population through the digital platform, but of course, how to keep it all safe. Well, thank you so much for being here, for contributing to our project, for all of the work that you are leading at the White House and with partners around the world. Again, it's been a pleasure to have you, and thank you so much, Anne.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Please now welcome to the stage NATO's Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Innovation, Hybrid, and Cyber, James Apatherai, and Microsoft's Corporate Vice President for Customer Security and Trust, Tom Burt, for a conversation on the role of cyber deterrence in modern warfare.
And I will correct that, I'm sorry. Hi, everybody.
We're going to continue the themes of the conversation that we just started with a few minutes ago with Anne, and this time have a NATO perspective as well as a private sector perspective. Before I dive into the questions, I just wanted to clarify that we are extremely honored to have Barbara McQuiston, who is the chair of the Defense Innovation Accelerator for the North Atlantic, the Diana Initiative, which if you're not familiar with what that is at NATO, you'll be able to learn in just a minute. So Barbara, thank you so much for being here. And Tom from Microsoft, we've had a great pleasure to partner with you on a number of occasions. Thank you for being here.
Glad to be here.
Let's dive right in, and I'm actually going to start with you, Tom, first, if I may. As we were just discussing with Anne a minute ago, so much of the global cyber infrastructure exists on private sector platforms, and there's a real need for government and industry to work together. So let me ask you this. Recognizing that cyber operations are becoming a common fixture in modern conflicts, what kinds of multi-stakeholder partnerships are necessary for effective cyber deterrence, whether that's through denial or whether that's through punishment? And what do you see as the roles and responsibilities of government versus industry?
Well, great question, and we could talk for way more time than we have to explore all of that. But let me say this. I think that both components, both deterrence by denial and deterrence by consequence or deterrence by punishment, are going to be critical to bringing under control the challenges that we face. And I'll start with by denial. And that's where the private sector in particular has the greatest role to play in collaboration many times with government, but also just on our own. So Microsoft is at a challenging time now because we were compromised by a Chinese actor last summer, as is, I think, well known, and then again by the Russian SVR towards the end of last year. Two significant compromises of the Microsoft corporate environment that gave those actors access to some customer email. So not okay. And not okay from Microsoft's perspective, a real wake-up message for us that as we built incredibly good and sophisticated tools for our customers, we weren't doing a good enough job ensuring that our own corporate environment was as secure as it needed to be. And that's turned into a major initiative across the company we call the Secure Future Initiative around, around security by design, by default, and by operation. We've mobilized 34,000 engineer full-time equivalents who are working around the clock on a wide range of initiatives across those various endeavors, with the ultimate goal being we have to be, because of the degree to which our customers rely on our technologies, we have to be the world's most secure computing environment. It's essential. And our CEO recognizes that. He's literally getting reports every week from the teams that are working on this and is directly involved. But he and the other corporate leadership have put a big, significant portion of their compensation dependent upon our execution of these security things. And we're driving it through the whole company by making everybody's annual review and rewards process dependent upon security. As Satya Nadella, our CEO, said, security has to be our top priority. If you have conflict in things you're going to do, make it about security. And so this is a reinvigoration of a security culture within the company. I got to say, it's unbelievably energizing to see the degree to which the entire company is pivoted into this and is working hard on it. But we have to do it. Where we need to work closely with government on regulation, and on how we address one of the problems that Ann Neuberger was talking about, which is the challenge that we see with our adversaries going after critical infrastructure. It was actually our Microsoft team that discovered the Chinese having opened these web shell backdoors across a wide range of critical infrastructure in the US and in other countries as well, a little over a year ago, last April. And we notified government about that, and we've been partnering with government on how to identify the critical infrastructure organizations that have been compromised, how to address that. As we think about both defense and resilience for those organizations, they tend to be smaller, they tend to be less well-resourced, and government needs to think about how it can help with both the resources and the incentives to lift the cybersecurity of these organizations. And primarily that means by moving them to the hyperscale cloud. Whether it's us or our competitors, the hyperscale cloud is where security is the greatest and where security innovation is going to happen. Then on the other hand, you have the need for the consequence. And, you know, Ann Neuberger was talking about the impact of ransomware. Just a couple data points. In the US alone, there have been over 389 healthcare institutions that have been successfully targeted by ransomware criminals. And there was a study by the University of Minnesota that attributed 67 deaths to ransomware activity just between 2017 and 2021. It's a serious problem, and it's a problem that we need to deter, not just because, not by just raising the defense capability, but we have to reduce the volume of attacks. So Microsoft was successfully compromised twice in the last 18 months, and that's not okay. On the other hand, over that same period, we had adversaries targeting our corporate environment 80 million times. And so you have to think about how successful do you expect the private sector to be ultimately in raising the level of defense. Now, we can do better. Microsoft has to do better. We can do better with critical infrastructure. But as much as we were facing those attacks, our data shows that our customers are attacked by either nation states or cyber criminals 345 million times every day. So we have to reduce the volume of attacks. And that means we need not just deterrence by denial, but deterrence by consequence. And that's where we need to partner more closely with government, however we can, and we are working with government partners on that, but it's a uniquely governmental role. And we need government to step up on what it can do through attribution. The alliances that Ms. Neuberger talked about are great, but we need governments to move more quickly, to be more specific about attribution, to be specific about the norm or the international legal principle that was violated, and then there have to be consequences.
Yeah, thank you for that. And again, you know, some really interesting and important data points in terms of the scale of the problem and the volume, as you were mentioning. And Barbara, I'd love to bring you into the conversation here, because picking up on what Tom was talking about and what Anne was mentioning earlier, you know, NATO is facing arguably its greatest test in the alliance's 75-year history. And you have a really interesting role as the chair of the Diana initiative, and as you're working to ensure that the alliance remains fit for purpose, tell us a little bit about how NATO is adapting to the evolving cyber threat landscape and what kinds of innovative efforts are underway to strengthen NATO's cyber deterrence capacity.
Well, as my role as the chair of NATO Diana, I've been very excited to see how innovation is coming into the conversation. So for those of you that aren't familiar with the Defense Innovation Accelerator for the North Atlantic, we're putting out challenges there. In fact, one of the challenges last year and this year includes data security and interoperability, because we want to get really sort of the bright engineers and scientists and entrepreneurs that can have ideas that they can put forward that have an impact not only in defense and security, but also the commercial area. As you can see, for national security, for NATO security, for across the alliance, these are areas that are just as important in the commercial realm for information security as it is for the military security. So the ideas that can come forward here, we need to not only be able to elicit it from the human capital across the NATO alliance, but then to also be able to accelerate its development, accelerate the business itself so that we can get these solutions out into the market and out into use for NATO allies. So this is a very, very important area, I think, in cybersecurity as we look towards a lot of the innovation also that's going on across NATO, the science and technology organizations looking at a lot of research and development and the defensive tools that are needed that can be implemented, and then also looking at sort of the digital transformation that's going on. We're more and more reliant on the data and on the capabilities that we need to have in the field and at the edge of where we operate. So this is something that is a large theme of all the activities, touches on NATO across the board. But being able to have the dual-use technology come in and very quickly play a role and very quickly be able to give you capabilities in the field and also be able to accelerate these ideas as we need them to keep at the pace of change and adoption that's needed for secure defense.
Yeah, thank you for that. And there's a couple of things I want to pick up on in terms of your response just now. We were chatting previously in the green room, and one of the things that we were discussing is that when it comes to NATO and its capabilities, so often diplomacy and armaments tend to dominate the conversation. But as you were alluding to a minute ago, you know, it's really important to also focus on the role of dual-use technologies. And so I'd love to hear a little bit more about how you see that fitting into the alliance's capabilities, its defense posture, and where we go from here. You know, what kinds of cyber threats are you all most concerned about, and how are you thinking about dual-use technology in relation to those?
In many ways, we're looking at information security and interoperability across the alliance, and also looking at zero-trust systems and a lot of the security implications that defense and security think about when they're putting things in the field and information in the field. With AI technology, sort of making sure that we can have a robust system that's defendable even with different and new attack surfaces. So it's a very rapid and quick pace environment. And how quickly can we take an idea, take a technology, and be able to adopt it into the field for being able to be responsive right away. But the ideas and the resources for emergent and disruptive technology are coming from the commercial space and from the entrepreneurs. So how closely can we connect with the security need, with the entrepreneurs that are actually coming up with these solutions? So we're looking to not only present the opportunity to accelerate the ideas, but also to be able to look at NATO overall changing in the way it does rapid adoption of the technology, so that we can actually do this as a united alliance across the board and be able to modernize and quickly adopt to the threat. I mean, a lot of the partners within the NATO alliance are constantly fielding these threats. That come from the Baltics, other regions individually, and how well can we actually position technology to help that in that pace to be defending themselves with this. We also need to think about the industrial base and the startup companies, how many tools and how much we can actually support, so we have that resilience in the industrial base, and we have the new technology playing a significant role there.
That's great. And, you know, it would be, when we think about emerging tech and its role, you know, we have to take a moment to focus on the role of AI. And Tom, I'd like to come back to you now with this. You know, let's talk about AI. And in particular, from your vantage point at Microsoft, how are you seeing AI shape both the opportunities for both cyber attackers and cyber defenders? What are you seeing take place, and what are you trying to prepare for?
Yeah, so our president, Brad Smith, has his book called Tools and Weapons, and certainly there is great concern about AI as the potential for our adversaries using AI technologies as a weapon. And one place where I can say I think the foundation innovation companies that are working on foundation models for AI, where we have a lot of good collaboration and communication, is what are we seeing in terms of adversary use of these technologies in their early days? And we have we observed some of the nation-state actors that we track utilizing OpenAI and Microsoft APIs to experiment with AI, but experiment in the same way that everybody is. You know, does it help us write code? Does it help us create images? Does it help us do the things that those technologies were intended for? And we just saw them experimenting, not doing anything particularly nefarious with it, but it was a concern. And so Microsoft adopted a policy that goes beyond anything we've ever done before, where we said if we see any adversary that we track, a nation-state actor or a cyber criminal syndicate, any of the roughly 600 that we track, utilizing our technology, we're going to affirmatively block it so that they can't use those technologies. And will that be a perfect solution? No, they can work through intermediaries, they can find ways to work around it, and it's always that cat and mouse game with our adversaries, but it's a step that we're taking. What's interesting, though, is to date, across all of the AI companies, we're all watching, and none of us have seen any adversary doing anything unexpected or particularly threatening with AI technology so far. Where we've seen the most use is in influence operations, especially by Russia and China, who have experimented a lot with using AI technologies to create so-called deepfakes, especially deepfake videos. What's most interesting, and we'll actually be publishing a report just at the end of this week on what we're seeing in terms of adversaries' efforts to influence all of the elections that are happening globally, and the upcoming U.S. election in particular, is in recent trends, what we're seeing is the adversaries are stepping away from using AI and are going back to what we call cheap fakes, where they're just taking existing images or other materials and making slight alterations or putting them in different contexts than were originally intended, or cropping them in some way to create a message that wouldn't otherwise be conveyed by the image. And we're seeing them moving back to that because they are actually seeing that they're more influential with that kind of content than with AI-generated video. Now, that's just probably a temporary thing. In the longer run, we have to be very vigilant for what we're seeing our adversaries do and be prepared to work with governments on how we respond to that, to minimize the risks. At the same time, though, I have this great confidence that in the intermediate term, and I think the timeline is something, and I'm making this up completely, but something like 3 to 7 year timeline, that AI is going to provide cybersecurity defenders with an asymmetric advantage over our attackers. And there's several reasons for that. The first reason is, to do AI, you need the world's best data scientists. And the private sector, especially those who are working on AI models, have those people. Now, not uniquely. Certainly the Chinese have a large number of very, very talented experts, and others do as well. But we have that. The second thing is unbelievable financial resources. So Microsoft is committing more than $12 billion every quarter to building the data centers with the GPUs that we need around the world to both train and operate these AI models. And our competitors are making similar investments. That's the greatest private sector capital investment in history. And it's coming from companies that have great financial resources. When you think about that, and you think about the ability of the cybercrime syndicates, or even most of the world's governments, they can't compete with the need to build those systems which they require to be able to do the work that they're going to want to do to counter the defenses we can build. So that gives us a significant advantage. And it takes the number of even governments that you have to be thoughtful about in this area down to a small number. And then there's the third component. Microsoft, because of the breadth and popularity of our products, we are now getting 78 trillion signals from our ecosystem that come into Microsoft every day. And that covers everything from endpoint devices to the most sophisticated cloud services and everything in between. That is a unique data set that we can train defensive AI models against. And we've seen that be successful in Ukraine with our Defender for Endpoint identifying Russian wiper malware and blocking it, not because we had a signature, not because we'd seen it before, because the algorithm said, wait, this code is up to no good. We are going to be able to build more sophisticated algorithms that are going to look at that stream of data and see adversary activity before it impacts customers and block it. I'm confident that that's going to be a capability. I know our teams are working on those capabilities now, and I'm confident that in that 3 to 7 year time frame, if we don't create a significant asymmetric advantage, we won't have done our job.
which again goes back to the human capital across the NATO countries that want to contribute to security and have ideas to put forward and emergent technology that can make a big difference. We need to be able to have opportunities for them to put their solutions forward for our national security.
I agree with that. And the other thing that is inherent in that statement by me is the need for the adoption of the hyperscale cloud. And again, irrelevant whether it's ours or our competitors, but those kinds of defenses can only be provided in the hyperscale cloud. And sovereign clouds not only will be targeted by our adversaries, as we saw in Ukraine, but they can't provide that same rich degree of cyber defense through the application of AI algorithms. So we need to, in the private sector, working with our government partners, has to improve security across all these technologies, but then also work with our partners on how we make those defenses really both available and effective.
Well, Tom, Barbara, I feel like we've only just scratched the surface. There's so much more we could discuss, and I know I have so many more questions for you, but I'm afraid we're out of time. So let me thank you for being here. Thank you for your respective leadership that you are forging ahead with, and we look forward to continuing to collaborate with you.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And now, please welcome to the stage U.S. State Department Under Secretary for Arms Control and International Security, Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins, for a conversation with FP's Ravi Agarwal on next-gen security.
Hello, everyone. Ambassador Jenkins, lovely to see you again.
Great.
Welcome.
Thank you for inviting me.
It's our pleasure. So, next-gen security. This week, of course, everyone who's coming in town is talking about, arms kind of procurement in a sense. And of course, your title says arms control. How are you thinking about this week? What are your priorities?
Well, thanks for the question, and really great to be here. I think this is a great opportunity to find ways we can continue to work with our NATO partners and allies on so many important issues. I know we've talked about a lot of this, and we've heard a lot about this today, but for me, it's an opportunity to reinforce the importance of the alliance, the importance of all the new challenges that we're facing in the international security space. And of course, emerging technologies is one of those areas where we have to continue to find ways to work together, because the only way we're going to be really to be able to address a lot of the challenges we have today is by working with partners and allies. And so this is an opportunity to really reinforce that importance.
Now, especially for the allies in Europe who have a real ongoing war to deal with, how much bandwidth are they able to give to emerging technologies? And how are you working with them to assist them in that process?
There's a real interest in emerging technologies and working with partners because, as I said, a recognition that so much of this is new. And so each country individually is trying to address these issues, but we also know that, as an alliance, we need to figure out how we can try to prevent unfortunate things from happening in the future. So a lot of the work that I do and my bureaus do, I have 3 bureaus that work underneath me. One is called the Arms Control, Deterrence, and Stability Bureau. The other one is Political Military Affairs, and the third is International Security and Non-Proliferation. All 3 of those bureaus are looking at these issues of emerging technologies, particularly not only how we can protect technologies, but also prevent in non-state actors and countries with intent to do harm from manipulating and using these technologies in an unfortunate way.
There's a real worry when we think about emerging technologies like AI, and we can dive into that a little bit more. But before we do that, I often get the sense that we're creating a world of haves and have-nots with many of these new emerging technologies. Some of it is access to the right kind of hardware, whether it's chips. Some of it is software and talent. And America clearly has this incredible advantage on each of those things. How are you thinking about working with countries that are not traditional U.S. allies? What does that look like?
Thank you. And that's a really important point, that we have to be able to ensure that technology is available for all countries, and that it is not a have and have not situation. You know, a lot of the work that we do, for example, at State Department is what we call promote, which is to find ways that we can work with different countries to understand what their goals are, what their ideals are, where can we work together on issues of emerging technologies. So there's a whole promote side, and we recognize the importance of working with countries around the world, particularly like-minded countries. And then on the other side, there's what I refer to as the prevent and protect side, where we understand that we don't want a world to be have and have-nots, and that we have to have, countries have to have access to these type of technologies.
Define like-minded countries.
You know, there are countries who understand the importance of responsible behavior, countries who recognize that we want to be able to use these type of technologies in a positive way to promote democracy, to promote international law, the rule of law, responsible behavior, to not do something that's discriminatory in any way. So countries that have these kind of ideals and want to use technologies in a very positive way that allows for free-flowing information are the kinds that we want to be continuing to work with.
Yeah. I mean, basically, every country on Earth would like to think of itself in that way if you read their own versions of what an international order looks like. But then let's move to the prevent side. So the countries that you are defining as not like-minded, you know, on AI, for example, how are you thinking about making sure that, you know, as you develop cutting-edge things, as you share them with allies, how do you prevent the people who shouldn't be getting their hands on it? That stuff.
Right. So in the context of the work that goes on in my bureaus, which are all, you know, most of the work within my 3 bureaus are prevent and protect, those some promote, which is really done by a different part of State Department. We have a couple things that we do. For example, one is we have a declaration called AI in the Military and Autonomy. And what this is we're working with 55 countries and hopefully more to promote responsible use of AI in the military. And so we've had a meeting with them earlier this year. They set up a number of working groups, and we're increasing the number of countries going to work with us to make sure that as countries use AI in the military, that they're using it in a responsible way. On the other side, some of the other things we're doing is more related to like export controls. And, you know, building on existing export controls that we have, how can we adjust those export controls to find how we can prevent countries who intend to use things in a very nefarious way from using those things in a nefarious way. And so we're working with a number of countries on that. And as I said, and I started out with, so much of this has to be done in a multilateral way. And so we're working with countries to understand what each country goals are, our ideals are, what we're thinking about in terms of how we're using the military, AI in the military, but in other ways to make sure that we prevent and protect countries, protect what we have, but also make sure we prevent misuse, as we do in many ways with export controls, for example.
Where does space fit into this for you right now? How concerned are you?
Well, I mean, everybody's been aware of the concerns that we've had with Russia and potential use of space for nefarious uses of nuclear. And so we are also, the State Department and Commerce is working together to see, again, are there export controls that we can use in that space in terms of technology? But also we are working in a multilateral way with other countries, again, to help ensure that there is a understanding that we cannot be using nuclear technology in terms of nefarious ways, nuclear weapons or anything like that in space. So you know the work that we tried to do at the UN, trying to get a resolution on that, which only failed because we had Russia, which went against it. But what that did is galvanize a lot of interest in countries to really focus on space and technology that could be used to make space a domain that's not safe.
You know, there are a few terms that have come up a fair bit in this conversation now. There's like-minded countries and therefore not like-minded countries. And then there's export controls. And it makes me wonder, when you have enough not like-minded countries, They've been called different things of late, the axis of resistance in the Middle East, or whether it's Russia and China, and then the countries that they like to pull into their pool. Doesn't that weaken then the idea of export controls when you have enough bigger countries that are partnering with each other to do, let's use the word nefarious activities in our definition here? How do you control them when they're just operating in a different ecosystem now?
Well, that's why it's so important from the very beginning to bring countries on board in terms of these norms and things that we want to develop. Fortunately, there are more countries that do want to abide by the norms. There's more countries that do want to abide by international law than there are that don't. And so in a diplomatic realm, what you do is you continue to engage countries. As the example of the AI in the military effort, it started out as an idea, and then we have been working to bring more countries in from around the world, not just from any particular region, from all countries around the world, to agree on this norm. And you develop this norm, and the more countries that join the norm, the more countries that you can say believe that this is the right way to go, this is the right way to be. Now, you'll always have countries who don't want to abide and want to do their own thing, but the idea is to have as many countries as possible, sign on to agreements or sign on to the norms building or go to the UN General Assembly and agree or something like that. That's how you do it. You build it, one by one, country by country, to develop these type of norms. And when you have something like emerging technologies, which is new and developing, you need to do this now. You need to do it not only with countries, you need to do it with private sector, you need to do it with industry. You need to be having these conversations with all the entities that are involved in these type of issues.
So here's a difficult question. Every time I travel to, Asia or Africa, I hear a very familiar narrative from leaders there, and it goes something like this. The rules-based order could work if America followed all the rules. And there's a growing sense that America's broken a lot of rules, whether you think of the unilateral invasion of Iraq, more recently, not being a signatory of the ICC, for example, calling for the ICC to sanction Putin but not Netanyahu. You can agree or disagree with any of the politics around this, but that is the refrain that we often hear among leaders in the Global South. I'm not disputing what you're saying, but how do you convince in this new world of emerging tech where you want to build norms and rules for AI and quantum, how do you tell your interlocutors that we may have broken rules ourselves in the past, but we're not going to do it in the future with this?
Yeah. Well, I think what the thing you have to do is make it we have our own domestic politics, and a lot of times countries understand our politics more than we understand our politics. But there are treaties, for example, that we still have not ratified that we would like to ratify. There are,
such as?
There's a number of, we call nuclear weapon-free zones that we need to get through Congress. There's a comprehensive nuclear test ban treaty that we need to get through Congress. There's things that we need to do that, unfortunately, we're not able to do for various reasons.
Right. And from the outside, it does not seem like a priority.
Yeah, but, we have said many times, for example, in the CTBT example, that it is a priority for the administration. So there's the reality of politics. There's a reality that there are things that we would, at least this administration, we would like to see not be a problem or that we're not getting out of. And so there is that domestic issue that we have to deal with, but at the same time, we want to also encourage not only domestically but internationally to do the right thing. So we have our struggles domestically, try to do the right thing, try not to withdraw from things that we don't think we should withdraw from, but we have a challenge internationally as well. So it's something we have to do on both sides. You don't want to sit here and say, well, we haven't done everything right, so we can't go out and promote what we think is right. We have to recognize it's both sides. It's a struggle both ways. Yeah.
So in a week like this one, where so much of the focus is about 2% military spending as the floor and not the ceiling, war is back, right? I mean, in a big way, on 2 continents and more. And I think leaders have woken up to that and they're thinking about rearming, they're thinking about security. And I guess for someone like you in your role, do you look at non-proliferation and think, gosh, that moment's past, it's dead?
No, I never think that because, you know, sometimes we look at the world today and we feel as if this time is different from any other time in the world. In some ways it might be, but in some ways it's not. And, you know, before we are able to make, let's say, an arms control treaty, there were moments where we didn't have the agreement. There were moments where we were fighting to get everyone to the table. So we need to look at this as just a time where we have to redouble our efforts on all these things, whether it's arms control, whether it's non-proliferation. We have to adjust the tools so that they better fit the new security environments that we have. We have a number of countries who are very committed to existing regimes, for example, that are with us and don't want regimes to go away. They want them to be adjusted because they recognize you don't want to be in a situation where you don't have non-proliferation, where you don't have export controls, where you don't have any of these tools. So you have to adjust the tools. You have to sit and recognize that there are changes in the security environment, and we have to stick with it. We can't give up. We have to, because these things are still important, even if you have a different challenge. It's Russia 1 minute, for example, and they're still in Ukraine. But the importance of non-proliferation does not change. We just have to realize we have a different challenge, and we still have to permit ourselves the effort to still achieve the goals, which have not changed, which is a world without nuclear weapons, or a world without chemical biological weapons, a world where we, you know, have agreements where we can sit around the table and have these kind of conversations. And in the emerging technology field, we got to figure out, how do we deal with this? Well, how do we, you know, develop some rules of the road? How do we develop some stability, some predictability in an evolving field where you have so many different actors, not just countries, but private sector, academia, think tanks, NGOs. This is a new environment. This is a new technology. So how do we take old ways that we've done it? How do we develop new ways to achieve the same overall goals?
Well, I'm glad you're not giving up, and I'll keep asking you questions about it.
Well, please do.
Thanks so much. Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins, real pleasure as always.
Appreciate it.
Next, please welcome to the stage the Norwegian Defense Research Establishment's Director of the Total Defense Division, Dr. Janet Martha Blatney, the U.S. Defense Department's Acting Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment, Deborah Rosenblum, and the Council on Strategic Risks Senior Fellow in the Jan E. Nolan Center on Strategic Weapons, the Honorable Andrew Weber, for a conversation with FP's Executive Vice President, Allison Carlson, on fortifying global biosecurity in the face of high-tech threats.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, both here in the room and online. We've had just an incredible program thus far this morning and this afternoon, and really appreciate you dedicating time as part of what is a very, very busy week. I'm particularly excited about this conversation because it's focused on an issue that is under-discussed and doesn't nearly get as much attention as it deserves. And so I'd like to thank all of our contributors and panelists today for elevating awareness about biosecurity. You know, we're coming out of a pandemic where bio-based threats and risks became a focal point for us and for people around the world. But unfortunately, what that also exposed is an incredible lack of preparedness generally. And whether bio-based threats and biosecurity risks are natural, accidental, or intentional and deliberate, they're becoming increasingly common and complex. And I think we need to be very clear-eyed about what those risks are, what the threat landscape looks like, and how we can work together, both across the public, private sector, civil society, to understand those threats, to invest in them, and to dedicate and be proactive about planning over the long haul. And so, Deputy Undersecretary, I'd like to start with you, and from your perspective, and the work that you've been doing. You know, the DoD just or recently finished the first bioposture review. And I'm curious why it was the first, and also what were some of the key findings? How would you characterize the threat landscape?
Yeah, so let me just take a brief step back from that particular piece. You know, when we all as a country and as a world came out of COVID, was also at the same time that we were continuing to look at the security environment and becoming very concerned about near-peer competitors, both the alliance as well as the United States, from Russia and China, but not exclusively. And so in looking at just having come out of a pandemic, what the strategic environment was, as well as the continued trends in science and technology, bio risks and bio threats really took on a prominence. The White House very quickly put out a national biodefense strategy, and the Secretary of Defense asked the department, how well prepared are we against any kind of bio threat, whether naturally occurring, the result of an accident in the lab, or some kind of state-based willful program. And it took about a year. The department reviewed, and the spoiler alert was that we're not that well prepared. Not that good work wasn't underway, but that it really didn't have a coherence and overall, you know, kind of from soup to nuts organization. And we also realized that we were not taking best advantage of the opportunity to collaborate and cooperate with our allies and partners.
Thank you for that. That helps to level set a little bit about, you know, what we're looking at and where we're at. Mandy, I'd like to turn to you. You know, you've spent your career all over the world grappling with various bio-based chemical threats, dealing with Ebola and the response there. When you think of your experience, but also what we're facing now as far as the threat landscape, the roles of technology, and how some of those threats are increasingly complex, compounding, and accelerating, what comes to mind for you, and how would you characterize that for our audience?
So the threat landscape is much worse for a few reasons. I was involved in dismantling the Soviet Union's massive biological weapons program, and we were pretty successful in gaining transparency, and with the exception of a few military laboratories. But now that Putin has reconstituted the biological weapons program, he's recklessly invaded Ukraine, my concern about Russian biological weapons is higher than it's ever been in my lifetime. And when I was serving at the Pentagon, we also were deeply concerned about North Korea and their bioweapons program, which continues to be very robust. And then there are the advancements in science and technology that make it easier to have better and more tailored biological weapons. This whole hybrid warfare. But there's also great promise in applying these tools to biodefense and having a robust research and development program, a global early warning system. I think, and I'm optimistic by nature, but the right vision is the one that's in the Biodefense Posture Review and the National Biodefense Strategy. Take these weapons off the table as a weapon of mass destruction, and we can achieve that.
You know, one of the concepts that we were talking about previously as it relates to hybrid warfare and cyber is denial by deterrence. And I think that's what both of you are referring to in terms of the need for greater planning, greater cohesion, and focus now to address and combat what are escalating and very, very real and near-term risks. And Janet, I'd like to bring you in. And first of all, thank you. Thank you very much for joining us today. You're joining us from Oslo, and I know it's quite late there, but appreciate you making the time. You know, one of the things that we want to focus on as well is the role of science and how science and research are absolutely needed to underpin the policies and the investments. And so I'd like to turn to you from your perspective and the work that you're doing, both within research but also in collaboration with NATO, how are you seeing that feed into what is denial by deterrence and more of a solidified defense posture?
Well, thank you so much. And first of all, thank you for having me, and apologies for not being able to be there in person due to last-minute changes. But however, but echoing the two previous speakers is that this is a huge threat space, and it has become so complex because of the incidents regarding natural events, deliberate events, as well as accidental events, but it also has the aspects of being combined with new technology, and that is either AI or data, even cyber. We have seen examples that cyber hacking can cause something, a biological event, and we are now entering the age of biotechnology. And biotechnology has been now identified by NATO as one of the most disrupting emerging technologies due to the huge opportunities it has, but also with respect to the dual use purposes. That is also the misuse of this area. And that brings me over to synthetic biology, where there is a lot of research needed in order to understand not only the opportunities this area provides, but also the threat it provides. Because we have to understand, let's say, how synthetic biology can be used to construct new microorganisms that we do not, or let's say that we are not able to identify, or that could even escape medical treatment. But at the same time, this area opens up for a lot of opportunities that I could rather come back to. But there's a lot of research going on within NATO Science and Technology Organization, and NATO has really strengthened its work within the biotechnological field because of the threat space this really has, and because of all the vulnerability it causes. And I can provide you also with some examples. COVID was mentioned, but COVID is very interesting here because what it showed was that it really hit so many sectors beyond defense. It hit the whole society. And this really tells us that we have to implement the plans that we are preparing for. We have to be able to understand our vulnerabilities, and it really can hit everybody. So supply chains was an example of this. Just to show that we are surrounded by bio all the time, and that is why biosecurity is so extremely important to deal with.
Very well put. Thank you for that. And I think you do key in on both the risks and opportunities as it relates to technology, and in particular AI, and the ways in which more collaboration needs to be done to focus on that. Development of countermeasures, for example, could be one way in which AI is utilized to combat and develop a greater deterrence posture. But Deborah, over to you. Did you want to pick up on
I wanted to build on what our previous speaker just talked about, because I think she raises a good point. And it goes to when you said kind of what's changed in the biodefense strategy, what's changed in the bioposture review. I think fundamentally, it's that by our better understanding where science and technology is going in these areas has led us to fundamentally change the paradigm. Whereas we used to live in a world where we felt fairly confident that we understood what kinds of chemicals, biological threats that were there, to now one in which we would not be able to have a degree of confidence going in, that we would know either what it was, if it were naturally occurring as a pandemic, what the nature of an accident was in a laboratory, or worse yet, if there was the willful introduction of a pathogen. So that's inverting on its head what we need to be prepared to defend against, and by virtue of that, to deter, an adversary from ever thinking they would have any kind of advantage that we wouldn't know. And so that is where it brings us back to the science and technology of having to rely very heavily on working and surviving in an environment where we may not know or understand early on what the nature of the biothreat is that's underway.
And in order to do that risk assessment, and when you're thinking about the DoD, the defense posture, and also, Andy, the programs and projects you're working on, where do you target your investments? And where do you prioritize to understand the complexity, but understanding or working in resource-scarce environments? How do you prioritize your programs and your investments to that end?
Well, I'll give an example. So pathogen early warning. If we have early warning systems at all of our military installations, and our allies do too, to monitor wastewater, to monitor air sampling, and then the health of our total force, including our civilians, we can hopefully use these incredible new technologies like metagenomics and detect early even the novel and unknown threats. And that all has to be connected to a rapid response system of platform medical countermeasures like the mRNA vaccine, which very few people know that DARPA, the Defense Department, was the major investor in mRNA vaccines for that very reason, because of our concern about engineered threats that we may never face until we're hit by it.
And so when you think about that and the partnerships that need to coalesce and deepen in order to have greater alignment on the investments that need to be made now, Dora, how are you thinking about that? And how does that dovetail with the investments that are being made across the DoD, and what needs to be prioritized now?
So probably the biggest share of the budget that defense spends overall on biological defense is in early warning. Because the earlier we can understand what it is that is making people sick, the earlier we're going to be able to know what the right countermeasures and protection is. That said, what we are encouraging is a lot of cooperation with our allies as we sit here in NATO summit this week, not just in the medical countermeasures and in the R&D with regards to the pathogens, but also in terms of what technologies can be leveraged for early warning and how we knit together early indicators, as Andy has talked about, if anomalies are beginning to show up in the wastewater, or anomalies are beginning to show up amongst wearables, giving us days, if not more than that, identification that there's something anomalous out there going on that will then enable us to more pinpoint what the nature of it is.
And you very rightly underscore how important this week is and the opportunity here to seize the discussion and the opportunity we have before us to raise attention and focus on these issues. And I'm wondering how that's being done across the pond, so to speak. And Andy, I'd like to turn to you. I know you recently came back from Finland, and there's the Global Biosecurity Accelerator and the partnerships and the dialogues that are deepening there, as well as Finland's commitment and the European Commission's commitment to investing more in biosecurity. I'm wondering if you can pinpoint some of the insights from those conversations that you had and what you're looking to for next steps as far as strengthening that international collaboration across the alliance.
Yeah, I was thrilled to join the Council on Strategic Risks and the Finnish Ministry of Defense to co-host this event in Helsinki with 17 allied countries, not just from NATO, but also from East Asia, where we spent several days talking about biodefense broadly and the need for resilience, for deterrence by denial, And we're going to build on that. There was a lot of receptivity. Countries need to be sure to get credit towards their defense GDP commitments under NATO, the 2% and higher. That should include biodefense, whether it's research and development or early warning, or even funds spent by their civilian agencies that are stockpiling medicines for health emergencies. I think it's very important that the United States Department of Defense and allied defense agencies increase the commitment of resources, and we're going to continue to push for that.
And Janet, I'd like to bring you in from a perspective from Norway. When you're working deeply on these issues and also working as part of NATO, what are you prioritizing and what are you looking at in terms of next steps, in terms of the concrete programs and investments that need to be made there? Earlier today, we were talking about potential fracturing of the alliance and what could potentially unfold in the years ahead. And so when you're underscoring the work that you're doing and also that within Norway, what are you focused on?
Thank you. I would like to bring back the emerging disruptive technologies because I think it's extremely important that we do have a very good understanding of this way forward, not only in Norway, what we are working on at our institute, but in NATO in general. And the more we can do in this area and being able to prepare ourselves for different type of events, if it's natural, accidental, or deliberate, the more we're building national security, building up better defense that also increases resilience and also our deterrence. But there's one aspect to this area that I also think is relevant mentioning, which we do not very often think about, and that is climate change. And there's a lot of focus also in Norway and in NATO dealing with climate change and security. Because one of the things that we see is the change of nature. And when nature changes, we are changing biodiversity. That also brings upon habitants for new diseases, which maybe nations do not have a healthcare system again. So we're back to being able to identify either, let's say, a new agent, a new disease, or even, let's say, the current common disease somewhere else, but which is not very well known in another area. And that brings me also back to synthetic biology, because even though that area represents a threat, a synthetic biology can also be used in the future for bioremediation. And that means that we can use microorganisms to degrade pollution in the environment. And these are the things we have to understand in total. So biosecurity is also very well linked to climate change. And this is also an area where NATO is working on. And I don't think we really acknowledge and understand how bio is involved in so many areas, which really makes this part so extremely challenging. So Norway and many allied nations are working with several of these topics that overall together really ensures better preparedness for NATO and our allies. Thank you.
If I could just piggyback off of that. Yeah, I think Janet brings up a very important point that is very relevant to NATO and the alliance and the, all of its member states, is that when we think about real-world events over the last 5 years, whether that be COVID and the pandemic, whether that be the invasion of Ukraine, as well as other world events, that is showing us that it gets very messy very quickly, no matter what the cause is, whether it was climate and some of the disease that she's talking about, whether that is something willful on the battlefield. We are learning, sadly, because of these events that are occurring, just what the impact is on logistics and sustainment and the ability to go about the war fight from a Department of Defense perspective and all of this. And I think what is happening is it is challenging our underlying assumptions, not just in the United States, but within the alliance and within each of the member country states. So we're saying that we need to start thinking about these things that could be occurring as asymmetric threats, whether they be naturally occurring or not, in much the same way that we think about cyber. And I know some of your early panelists were talking about cyber, and it's been around long enough that you begin to think through, oh, what could be the impact of a cyber attack if there were to be some kind of event. And I think it is very important as an alliance, and this is one of the things that came out of the biodefense review, was that we need to be thinking about bio risks, whatever they may be, in much that same way.
You know, anything about the Biological Weapons Convention from the 1970s, and the question becomes, what needs to be done now to ensure that that's fit for purpose for the complexity of risks that we're all facing and the intensity of those risks as well. And so in the few minutes that we have left, I'd like to turn to each of you. We can seize this moment. This is an opportunity, and we don't just want to focus on all of the risks, but what is being done concretely, and also what needs to be focused on this week so that we don't let this opportunity pass us by. And so if you think about this convening this week here in Washington, from each of your perspectives, what needs to be the focus as it relates to biosecurity to make sure that these issues remain on the agenda?
Why don't you kick us off?
Well, I think biodefense, and thank you to foreign policy for putting it on the agenda. It needs to be very high on the agenda because of the threat level. And the battlefield in this century is different. It's not a piece of real estate. It's here in the United States. It's throughout Europe. It's at our logistics nodes. So contested logistics are very vulnerable to covert bioattacks by state actors like Russia, North Korea, perhaps even China. And we have not fully appreciated that, I think, until recent years. We now have a good common threat picture at the classified and unclassified level. And we have to build on that. And we have to have highly visible investments in biodefense, early warning, medical countermeasures, and we have to do that hand in glove with our civilian counterparts in the health ministries.
Janet, I'll go to you, and then Deborah, I'll end with you.
Yes, thank you. I think, first of all, we really have to acknowledge that biodefense is an important area to further invest in, because there has been so many events when you look back that really has shown our vulnerabilities. So we have to be proactive and not reactive. And the only way of being proactive is also providing investments into this area from many, many, many perspectives: science and technology, healthcare, defense, and so on and so on. But I think it's extremely important to understand the threat, because there's so much misinformation and disinformation out there. So we need facts to be able to be provided to the decision makers who are going to be able to provide the relevant funding in this area. And of course, we have to have the legal frameworks for this. But it's about recognizing the threat, understanding our vulnerabilities, and also being prepared for the next event. Thank you.
Thank you for raising the mis and disinformation issue, which is pervasive and incredibly important, and also underscoring the importance of evidence-based research and facts. And so, to bring us home, Deborah, I'd like to turn to you. How can we make sure that biosecurity remains on the agenda?
I think we need to be very clear as an alliance and individual member states with regards to the norms around this whole area. You asked us about the BWC and some of the other forums. I mean, we're seeing a steady erosion of that. and the use of disinformation and misinformation to continue to erode at that. And I think we have to be very clear in our messaging that this is something that we will not tolerate, that we should not tolerate, that this is not something that should be treated as business as usual by any means, and that we need to absolutely be unified in keeping it high on our agenda, not just in terms of the work that's getting done, but the way in which we talk about it as an alliance and the way in which we communicate with other parts of the world with regards to this, because this is a challenge that is not unique to Europe and to the NATO alliance, but is absolutely something that touches every single continent and every single country, and we need to be absolutely clear with regards to that. So thank you very much to Foreign Policy.
Thank you for joining us. Thank you for your ongoing work on this issue, and best of luck to all of you this week and as we go forward. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Please now welcome to the stage Canadian Minister of National Defence, Bill Blair, for a conversation with FP's Ravi Agrawal on defence in the Arctic.
Hello, everyone. Bill Blair, you are the Canadian Defense Minister. Welcome to Washington.
Thank you very much, Ravi.
When did you get in?
This morning. I flew up here with my Prime Minister.
Right, so I have the advantage of not being jet-lagged. I'm going to begin with the elephant in the room. This is obviously a week where a lot of NATO leaders are in town, and one of the big themes is 2% of GDP for every single country being the floor, not the ceiling, for defense spending. And Canada's is, I think, at about 1.3% and change.
It is at the moment. I introduced a new defense policy update for my government, and with a budget that will see my defense budget rise by 27% next year over this.
My quick math tells me that still takes you to 1.7.
And that's exactly where it takes me. But let me acknowledge to you, NATO's right. Every country, member of NATO, has to do more, and we're committed to doing more. We are also committed to the 2% expenditure at GDP. One of the challenges, I think every defense minister, and I get to meet with them all on a regular basis, it's not just a matter of how much you spend, but it's a matter of spending it well and making sure that you can produce real value for our armed forces, for our NATO alliance and all of our partners, but also for our taxpayers. And I need to be able to demonstrate, like, I think I've got a very clear path. I know exactly what I need to invest in. I've got to replace my destroyers, my naval ships. I've got to replace our submarines. I've signed contracts for almost 200 new aircraft for my Air Force just in the past year and a half. But I've got to make sure that we can actually deliver on those commitments and create that credibly. You know, I've often said, I think the two great challenges every defense minister has is getting the money and spending the money well. And so all that is to say, Canada understands its obligation. I feel that responsibility gravely, and we're working really hard. The defense policy update that we've just produced moves us forward very substantially and doesn't get us entirely where we need to go. But there are things in that document as well that talks about the investments we know we have to make. Replacing the submarines, for example, creating a new integrated air and missile defense system for Canada's responsibility in North America. All of those things inevitably take me over 2%.
So, but there are people in this town who will say that is a lot of words, and what you're saying is we will be more efficient. The subtext could be that other countries are not. But the criticism still remains. I mean, America's defense spending is way north of 2%.
Yes.
That Canada might be seen as a free rider.
And I have no intention of Canada being a free rider. First of all, we've already made a commitment to NORAD. NORAD is our most important relationship here in North America with the United States. We're investing nearly $40 billion into NORAD modernization, including over-the-horizon radar systems, new satellite systems, a number of very significant capabilities. We understand our responsibility to that relationship. Similarly, in Europe and in NATO. Canada's leading the forward enhanced presence in Latvia. We're making very significant investments there. I'm in complete agreement with my allies that Canada must do more. The day I got this job, I've very publicly taken that position. We must do more, and we will do more. I've got a lot of work to do to make sure that we spend that money well, that we create the capabilities that we require. One of the challenges I'm also facing is we've got some real staffing challenges in the Canadian Armed Forces. I've got to address that problem so I can have sailors on those ships, people to fly those planes, soldiers to do the important work that we're asking them to do. And so all of that work is, I think we have a very aggressive plan to move forward. I'm very confident that it's going to bring us to that threshold, but I think it also has to be a credible plan. It has to be verifiable to our allies. It can't just be an aspirational approach. I think you've got to really come out and say, this is what we need to do, and this is how we're going to get it done. And I'm hoping that over the course of the next few days, I'll be able to share that credible, verifiable plan with our allies to provide them with assurances that Canada understands its responsibility and we're going to live up to our responsibilities.
All right. Well, there'll be a lot of defense ministers in town this week who will ask you that question, and you've previewed your answer. I want to talk about the Arctic as part of, Canada's defense arena and, an increasing priority for NATO. Before I go there, one more elephant in the room. Of
course.
In the last 2 weeks, a lot has happened in the United States. I'm sure you've been watching it closely. There's a greater likelihood that Donald Trump will be president. Anything could happen, but the polls suggest that there's a greater likelihood. This is a former president, potentially future president, who has called your prime minister two-faced. He has called him a whole bunch of other words as well, and has said he's very disappointed in him. How worried is your government about a potential second Trump term?
I was a minister in the government during the first Trump term. I also believe very strongly, first of all, with respect to the American election, I have great confidence in Americans to make whatever decision, and we'll respect whatever decision they may make. But I also know the strength of America, and it includes the White House, obviously, and the president, but it's also the institutions. It's your Congress, it's your judiciary. I've had the opportunity over the course of a very long career in public safety and public security to work very closely with America. I have great confidence in your institutions and the people that lead those institutions. I remain confident. Canada will always be a good partner to the United States, and the United States has been our closest ally and our dearest friend.
Yeah, you really have been doing this for a long time, very diplomatic. Okay, the Arctic. Talk to me about how you are seeing that as a new arena and the threat of Russia from the other side, as it were.
Well, first of all, when I became the defense minister, most of the work that we had done previously in defense policies, to me it looked an awful lot like a shopping list, and it did not tell our story. It didn't tell the story of Canada. And so when I got this job, and I got my people to start really thinking about what are our real responsibilities. We have obviously responsibilities in Europe and NATO. We have new responsibilities in the Indo-Pacific because we're both an Atlantic and a Pacific nation. But I think most closely related to our identity as a nation is we're an Arctic nation. And I think for very many years, we've relied on the fact that we are surrounded by 3 oceans, one of which was mostly frozen most of the time. And we also had the benefit of a superpower and a very friendly neighbor.
And geography.
And geography.
Amazing geography.
We had remarkable geography. And almost everything the Canadian Armed Forces has done over the last 150 years has been expeditionary.
Right.
It's been, we've never been really invaded as a country. We've had a couple of little incursions, but nothing serious. And so, one of the things that we recognize, though, with climate change in particular, is that our Arctic is becoming far more accessible. And we used to think, I think naively, that maintaining our sovereignty and security in the Arctic was occasionally flying a plane overhead or having a ship go by when the ice was out. But we believe with climate change, first of all, the Arctic is warming at 4 times the global rate. Secondly, the Arctic Ocean, by 2050, could very easily be the main point of passage between Europe and Asia.
That just blows my mind.
And it should. For us, it creates both opportunity and challenge. And what we are seeing among adversaries, Russia and China in particular, is a far more assertive approach into what we have always considered our Arctic. And I know it's a concern for America in Alaska. It's a concern for Greenland and the Danes. It's a concern for our new NATO allies in Finland and Sweden, and obviously in Norway and Iceland. But I think the incursions that we're seeing, the effort of China, which now calls itself a near Arctic nation, they're sending ships into the region. They're dual-purpose ships, but they're gathering intelligence. They're also working very hard to try to invest in critical infrastructure, our critical minerals. It is a concern to us. And frankly, I believe that we have a responsibility, not just to assert our sovereignty, but to be prepared to defend it.
How have things changed in the last year with Sweden and Finland joining NATO?
Very positively, in my opinion. First of all, I've met a number of times with all of the Nordic and Arctic nations. I think what we're starting to see clearly within NATO, there's an obvious and necessary focus on the Eastern Front with Russia, but we're also recognizing the northern frontier of NATO, which is Norway, Finland, Sweden, the Danes, Iceland, us and America, all have a responsibility there. Canada has the largest maritime border with Russia of any country in the world. And frankly, we're not persistently present there. And so one of the things I've come forward with in our new national defense policy is significant new investments and capability to create northern support hubs to build up our domain awareness through over-the-horizon radar investments, but also creating integrated air and missile defense systems, new maritime capabilities, new maritime sensors. Lots of very significant investments are going to be necessary. But I think there's a huge opportunity with Finland and Sweden particularly coming in. Norway has always been a strong partner. An acknowledgement among all the Arctic nations that we can do better together.
Just to come back to the money, because you were talking about investments there, 27% is a lot, right? Have you been able to convince the Canadian population of the importance of these investments? Yeah. Because obviously it takes away from other stuff.
Well, and I'll tell you, when I first got into this job, we did some polling on it, and about less than a third of Canadians really supported defense spending. And it didn't make the top 20 list of priorities. But we've had a very robust conversation with Canadians over the past year. We've talked about not just the risks. Frankly, I don't like scaring people. I'm a police chief, and in my earlier life, and I just don't like making people afraid. But at the same time, you need to make them aware of the challenges that we face and of our responsibilities. And what we've seen just over the past year in Canada, support for defense spending has more than doubled. It's over 65% right now. And it's gone from not on the top 20 list of spending priorities into the top 5. And so I think that the conversation has been a good one with Canadians. There's a good understanding that we have to make these investments, and it's not just. I will confess to you, it's kind of difficult to go and explain to your population that we need to spend this much money to meet a mathematical formula. You've got to talk about why, and you've got to talk about how.
Well, and also the threat is much further away. You're not Poland.
We're not, but the threat's coming to our door. And it's because the Arctic, as I've said, is becoming far more accessible than it was ever in the past. And the nature of technology and conflict is changing as well. And so what we're seeing, we saw with the use of drones, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and Iran's attack on Israel. We see it every single day in the Ukraine. And we see it through asymmetrical warfare, which includes cyber attacks. Like, all of these things is making our security a greater challenge. And you know, what we understand that we need to do is we need to make our adversaries think twice before they just come and take advantage of the opportunity that exists in North America. I also very mindful I have responsibilities to my American colleagues as well. They've made a huge investment in security for the Beaufort and the Bering in Alaska. But right now, there's not an awful lot between Alaska and Greenland, and that's my responsibility, and we're going to live up to it.
They'll be listening to you this week. We haven't talked about China much, but very quickly, you know, in this town, there's been a real shift in attitudes towards China in the last 5 years. Europe, it's a bit more mixed. Where does Canada sit?
I have gone to NATO a number of times. I had a number of conversations. I was in Singapore just last month. I met with the Chinese defense minister. I told him that I've been sending my ships through the Taiwan Strait. We do it with the Americans, we do it with a number of allies, because we believe in the importance of defending the principle of freedom of navigation in international waterways. We talked about, actually, I had a very candid conversation with my counterpart about foreign interference in our domestic, in our elections, against our critical infrastructure, some of the cyber attacks that we have seen, which we believe are done either by the PRC or by their proxies. And we talked about, frankly, the coercive activities that they engage in against our citizens who may be of Chinese descent, none of which is acceptable. And I think it's important to have those conversations with them. And at the same time, I think being aware of those risks and responding appropriately. I'm not trying to start a fight, I'm trying to prevent one. And I think by being strong and by being united with our NATO and American partners and in the Indo-Pacific, I think everybody's trying, and certainly in the Indo-Pacific, they're trying to find that place where, between America and China and where the right place to be. I know where my place is in that relationship, and of course it's our closest ally and partners is obviously with the United States. But in the defense of North America, you may recall the Chinese sent surveillance balloons over top of the continent. That was concerning. We've also seen, as I said, dual-use ships going into the Arctic Ocean, and clearly intelligence gathering and mapping. And we've seen a number of efforts that they've made to try to invest in our critical infrastructure. They've done it around the world, but we're taking the steps necessary to defend our interests. And I think there's more to be done. Canada, I believe, has been strong in its response and needs to be even stronger among our allies.
Last question, India. This is an area of great divergence between Canada and the United States. The US and India have been improving their relationship over the last 20 years. Canada's in the last 18 months has declined precipitously. What do you think is going to change? Modi just won another 5 years. It's a difficult relationship. How do you think that's going to change?
It's a difficult relationship, but it's an important relationship. Canada needs India, and I believe India needs Canada as well. First of all, we have a very substantial Indian diaspora in Canada, and it's an important relationship to those Canadians as well. But the trade relationship, I think we've got some work to do. There are some challenges. I think you'd acknowledge that. There have been some challenges with respect to the actions and the evidence of the Indian government engaging with part of our Indian diaspora in Canada.
This was an assassination, which they denied. You claim that India was responsible.
But at the same time, I would also acknowledge too, that relationship is an important one. And I think what mature governments do is what we're doing now, is working through that relationship. Yes, they have strong areas of divergence where we just fundamentally disagree. But at the same time, I think we have a responsibility to the future of both of our countries, is to work it out and to find a way to reconcile that so it's mutually respectful. And at the same time, they've got work to do. And I think, by the way, on the defense side, one of the things that I've been encouraging is my military to reach out and maintain those relationships. I think there are opportunities to the extent possible, to normalize the relationship. Now, while we still reconcile the challenges that exist between us, but I think it's very much in my country's national interest and in India's interest that we find a way to work through the challenges that we face between us and make it work. And I think that's the responsible, even frankly with all the difficulties we have with China. I would also acknowledge China as a very significant economic power in this country and an emerging military power as well. It is incumbent upon us to find ways to peacefully coexist and at the same time draw very clear lines about what is acceptable and what is not.
Here's to that. Minister Blair, real pleasure.
Thank you, Ravi.
Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage the Defense Innovation Unit's Deputy Director for Strategy, Policy, and National Security Partnerships, Aditi Kumar, Managing Partner at the NATO Innovation Fund, Andrea Traversoni, and Shield AI co-founder and president, Brandon Sang, for a conversation with FP's Pentagon and National Security reporter, Jack Detch, on accelerating innovation financing across the NATO alliance.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for sticking with us all day. It's been impressive energy throughout. We'll see how the week unfolds here at NATO. Interesting aligning three different innovation cultures. You have Silicon Valley, DoD, and NATO. That's what I'm here to talk to this distinguished panel about. Aditi, I wanted to start with you about how you're getting on the same page across these three different lanes. You have Silicon Valley and DC getting acquainted with DIU. How do you throw NATO into that mix?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. Thank you for listening. So, you know, we are in the midst of implementing our DIU 3.0 strategy, and it is a very exciting time for DIU. Obviously, we've built these relationships with the tech sector for many years, and it's now time for us to scale and show that we can, you know, integrate the latest technology into U.S. Military forces, and then working with our allies and partners as well. So I have the privilege of leading our global partnerships portfolio, which is one of the main tenets of our DIU 3.0 strategy. And we're doing a few things to really invest in our global relationships. The first is direct relationships with ministries of defense, NATO countries being our foremost partners. And we are doing a variety of things with them, including joint accelerators where we're putting firms, US firms, international firms through programming, getting them used to working not only with the DoD, but our partner ministries of defense. We are putting embeds into other ministries of defense and welcoming them into ours, and so we can have closer ties and work on projects together. And we're creating direct opportunities for firms. We are using our commercial solutions opening process, which DIU has leveraged for many years to bring in new technologies and new entrants into the DoD in a low-cost, low-barrier way. CSOs are open to international firms. And in fact, we have awarded to 27 companies across 10 countries in past years. And so we're trying to deepen those relationships, making sure that we're getting those CSO opportunities out so that we can do more work with the tech ecosystems, not just domestically, but globally as well.
Andrea, one of the things we were talking about backstage is you're trying to accelerate the number of NATO countries that are actually involved in innovation. You have 24. You'd like to get to all of the alliance, 32. Is NATO's adoption of commercial tech moving fast enough, and what should the innovation priorities look like for the alliance?
So obviously one important piece is procurement policies. So at the NATO Innovation Fund, we are building an adoption team that helps our portfolio company sell into the 24 current allies investors in our fund. And obviously interoperability is a big theme for us and our portfolio company, and standardization of procurement and rapid procurement. NATO is developing a new initiative around rapid procurement for young technology companies and startups to be adopted faster. And we are looking forward to inputting that initiative and to drive our portfolio companies through that new path and to accelerate adoption for them.
And the other issue we were talking about is how do you prevent those companies as they're in the growth phase from getting snapped up by Chinese adversarial capital? Correct.
One of our key drivers, or one of our key goals, is what we call protect. Protect meaning protecting the IP of the companies we invest in from adversarial capital. So when we invest, we do a lot of work with our portfolio company to make sure that there is no adversarial capital involved in the company, and making sure that we put in place procedures and policies to protect this intellectual property and this product to be basically transferred to adversary capital.
Brandon, I know you're meeting with some European partners, companies on the sidelines of this NATO summit. In the past several years, we've seen the U.S. really expand new entrants in the defense field in a big way. Do you see that same defense tech ecosystem mobilizing in Europe as you've seen these calls for more entrants to get involved?
I think it's to be determined still in terms of how it's going to play out in Europe. It is a very different capital ecosystem than the United States. The United States benefits from having a venture capital ecosystem that is much larger than any other system on the planet, and that really benefits entrepreneurs, young companies. And when you look at the technology sectors that are going to make a difference in defense, and I think about two, it's the combination of software and low-cost hardware, low-cost drones. The United States obviously has a premier software ecosystem as well, and that's because we have a premier venture capital ecosystem. And so that is, I think you're still going to see a lot coming out of that U.S. ecosystem, and it's nascent in Europe. Certainly Europe has its wins in terms of the companies that it has produced, but it's just a very different ecosystem. So I think we're still in early innings. Obviously, I think it's good for NATO. I think it's good for the United States. I think it's good for everybody to have that environment, but it's certainly more of an uphill battle when you don't have those when you don't have that system in place already.
Is there a valley of death in Europe, some equivalent to what we see in the United States?
Oh yeah, yeah. There's a valley of death in Europe. There's a valley of death in the United States. It's any democratic country generally has a valley of death in terms of, because I think they've all mimicked the U.S. acquisition process, which is not what I would recommend in terms of how we buy things, right? And I think it's something DIU is trying to certainly disrupt and figure out how we can buy things differently. But because you have all these countries replicating how the United States has bought things in the past, you have valley of deaths in near all Western democracies.
Fair, and I want to get to ADT in a second, but Andrea, where you sit, do you agree with that characterization? Is that something that you see as you're looking for more companies to get into rapid procurement in NATO?
I mean, I often make the comparison, having invested in deep tech for 25 years, that to be honest with you, the value of that exists in most deep tech sectors, probably software being the only exception. I've invested in medtech company where there is a huge value of that to be adopted by the large national health services. In the telecom world, if you want to sell to some of the largest mobile or fixed operators, you have to go through 2-3 years of testing. So I think it's just an element of how you build a deep tech business. The procurement patterns are different by industry, but they're still very long. When you have critical infrastructure and critical strategic technologies, the buyer, particularly when it is a very sophisticated buyer, whether it is in healthcare or the defense world, it just takes a long time, whether it is certification, development, integration, and adoption. So to me, it's just a phase of development of a company.
Ajiti, one thing that queued you up in DIU earlier in the conversation is buying things differently, looking at procurement acquisition processes. One thing I'm curious about is, as we sort of have this conversation transatlantically about the arsenal of democracy, you have 23 out of 32 NATO countries now at 2%. I guess, what does that mean from an innovation standpoint? Do you see these countries innovating? Do you see them spending money on the right things? Do you see them fixing their processes? Or are they just spending money after the same old bad processes?
I mean, we're having very productive conversations with our counterparts on how we bridge the many valleys of death that exist, not just in DoD, but in their ministries as well. And you're right, the challenges are common. And I think one of the benefits of this alliance is that we can work on those together in a very tight-knit way. And so, one learning has been, how do we get the agile, rapid acquisition processes into all of our MODs? But it doesn't stop there, right? As Brandon and others know, the valleys are multiple and they follow basically every process that the capability has to go through to get to the warfighter. So if you're not working with your combatant commanders to develop a concept of operations that makes sense, you're not going to get acquired at scale. If you're not working with the joint staff and with research and engineering to make sure that the experimentation schedule is accelerated on time, gets the results, your reports get to the company in time, and they're making the necessary upgrades, you're not going to get procured at scale. So there are so many different processes that need to be aligned along the way. And that's what DIU is trying to do across the whole life cycle, and that's what we're partnering with other ministries to do across the NATO alliance, is how do we share those lessons learned, how do we use our personnel exchanges, our best practices to make sure that we're all fixing those types of issues together.
One thing that NATO, of course, has been doing in the lead up to the summit as they're developing war plans is going around and getting countries in line with the capabilities requirements. Do you see sort of a parallel in tech? Should there be requirements for development of new tech, for setting requirements for innovation, those sorts of things? Should that be baked into that process, or is that too prescriptive?
I think we need to build flexibility into the system, absolutely. I think the requirements that we specify need to be warfighter-centric, and I think that means that we're making room for cutting-edge technology to make it into the system, and we're working with the engines of scale in each of our respective departments to make sure that the buyer is there at the other end is willing to make those upgrades. And this is where I think the hardware-software issue that you started to talk about, Brandon, becomes really important, right? So how do we invest in hardware that makes sense for all of us, but then do acquisition in a way where we're allowing software upgrades in the way that our capabilities can stay ahead of the curve and meet the warfighter need? And one example of that is in the unmanned aerial system space that Brandon knows well. How do we create the right mechanisms to make sure that what the Ukrainians are seeing, which is the tech needs to be updated every 90 days or even sooner, that we're staying abreast of that cycle? I think those are the types of conversations that we should be having in terms of how do you bake in innovation into your acquisition cycle.
But it sounds like, and Brandon, I'm curious to get your take, it sounds like countries in the NATO alliance aren't as nimble even as the Ukrainians in doing those, pushing those software updates, doing those types of things.
Yeah, and a couple of things there. One, I'm very much, if you've ever heard me talk about this, I'm very much against the requirements process. I think it should be thrown out, trashed, the entire thing, day one, right? It's the old saying, if you asked Henry Ford what people wanted, they would have said faster horses, right? Horses that can go farther. They're not asking for a car. What entrepreneurs do, what companies do, is they want to know your problems, and then they want to come up with solutions to solve your problems. And so I think that needs to be that's a policy challenge in the U.S., in NATO, abroad, because every country is always, they're fundamentally set on the requirements process, and all these countries, all you guys are getting are faster horses, right? And so that's why I say just throw it out, start with a different acquisition process that is problem-centric, that's problem-based first and foremost. And then just a quick go back. I think it is important to recognize, I don't think Europe should try and replicate what is going on in the United States as it relates to defense technology, as it relates to, it'd be taking on the United States as it relates to software development and AI development is a monumental challenge where we are investing hundreds of billions of dollars. What I think, honestly, in terms of what needs to happen is Europe needs to look at Europe-centric problems and say, what's the best way to actually solve these problems? Where can we actually, drive speciality? Because otherwise, you're just going to get protectionist policies, protectionist regulations, where you're not going to end up with the best capability for your military. And that would be my principal concern of Europe trying to just replicate what's going on here in the United States rather than specialize for the problems that are centric to their market and that need to be solved in their market.
Well, speaking of faster,
and where they can leverage partners like the U.S. or partners, abroad in Asia, in the Middle East, et cetera.
Speaking of Henry Ford and faster horses, I guess we'll see if NATO makes any upgrades to its cavalry at this summit. Not expected, but one thing I'm curious about, Andrea, is we hear a lot of talk out of the alliance, especially the Nordic countries, about resilience, about being ready for war, about readying the entire society for war. And indeed, it seems like the NATO countries may put something forward to that regard at the summit. When you look at the tech ecosystem, how do you mobilize, how do you prepare for war, how do you prepare for an Article 5 across that type of portfolio?
We're already seeing entrepreneurs reacting to that. So our key themes is deep tech, addressing defense, security, and resilience. Some of the key areas where we're seeing this issue because of what happened recently is energy resilience. And we're looking at multiple technology, for example, that are addressing the electricity grid resilience. We're looking at resilience of supply chains and many others. This is one of the key areas where entrepreneurs are already seeing a potential need and a market demand, and they are starting companies to fulfill that future need.
One thing, Aditi, that you've been working on very closely at DIU is the replicator program, and obviously Ukraine has changed the defense tech ecosystem quite a bit in terms of countries wanting to field cheaper, larger swarms of drones. Is there a relevance of sort of these types of initiatives that DoD is working on towards Europe? Because, of course, some of the things that you're working on at DIU very closely map to the Indo-Pacific, but just curious about the relevance in this theater.
It is absolutely relevant and, in fact, informed by the lessons that we're learning in real time, unfortunately, in Ukraine. So absolutely, we are integrating. We have DIU personnel in EUCOM that are embedded there that are feeding us information about what is working. We're learning a lot about the types of contested environments that we face today and are likely to face in the future, and learning about what the department needs to do to be prepared for that. So how do we think about resilient communications? How do we think about collaborative autonomy in these settings? How do we build, I mean, a lot of these capabilities are pushing the frontier of what we have done in the past. And so I think Replicator is definitely helping us push the boundary forward. Replicator in and of itself is not going to be, you know, the department's solution to all of autonomy. There's a lot of work going on across the department. And there's a lot of work going on with our NATO partners. I mean, the UK has its drone defense strategy. Other nations are pursuing similar efforts. And so the importance of unmanned systems in all domains cannot be underestimated. And I think that this alliance, again, is a good opportunity for us to take the lessons from the EUCOM theater and build and really push the frontier of technology.
Just keeping the focus sort of on Ukraine and collaboration between adversaries. We see, of course, the Chinese providing microchips to the Russians. We see sort of a collaborative ecosystem and a focus in China around civil-military fusion. Is there anything that worries you specifically about the way that China and Russia are approaching tech adoption? Are there ways that they're ahead of the curve? And is there any way that the alliance or the U.S. should be countering this?
Yeah, I think that we are taking a lot of the right steps. I mean, this is why initiatives like the NATO Innovation Fund are so important, right? We share the same goals, which is how do we protect our supply chains from adversary influence? How do we build those capabilities, not just domestically, but in our allies and partners? I think that is a huge focus of our effort. How do we grow our industrial base, and how do we create an ecosystem where we're giving the defense industrial base problems to solve rather than prescriptions, as Brandon said? Those are all efforts that DIU is pushing. And at the end of the day, I think, you know, our focus is obviously commercial. How do we bring in commercial tech, dual-use tech into the ecosystem? And I think that is where the U.S. and our allies and partners have a real edge, and that is where we should be investing. That is where we should be putting our energies, is to bring the best of our tech talent into the ecosystem.
Yeah, and certainly one thing I wanted to pose to the panel, Andrea, maybe, is just sort of the back and forth that we hear in Washington. I'm curious if this is mirrored in Brussels and European capitals as well, about sort of the failure to speed up innovation, speed up defense spending as quickly as possible. There's sort of a blame game that goes on. Government says industry is not taking enough risk, perhaps. Industry says that government's not making the needed investments. Who do you see sort of at fault here, as it seems like there's sort of a common trend in the conversations that things aren't moving fast enough?
I think there's been a bit of an awakening happening in the past maybe couple of years about defense being probably another area that we should look at from an investment point of view, like ESG, and dual use, how it should be an investment category. So at the NIF, we work very hard with the European Investment Fund and the European Investment Bank to change the policy around dual-use investing. So now they are allowing the fund that they invest in to do dual-use investment, investing in defense technologies. These will attract, over the next 10 years, a lot of private capital, because these are the largest investor in VC funds in Europe, which will need to go and raise private capital. And these will trickle down to those companies that are building these technologies in defense, security, and resilience. So I think finally there is a waking up to the fact that we need to accelerate this investment. If we look what the Chinese government is doing from a top-down point of view, we need to be able to align all the incentive to replicate that as far as we can. And I think things are moving.
So there is a model that the Chinese and the Russians perhaps are providing on the adversarial side that the allies can build off of. I
wouldn't necessarily call it a model. I just think that they're showing how they're doing it much faster at a much bigger scale, and it has been a bit of awakening here in Europe for multiple governments to line up, invest in our fund, for example, and now the European Investment Fund following up with the change in policy.
Brandon, from where you sit in industry, sort of how do you see sort of that back and forth, the finger pointing between industry and government?
I don't think it's super productive to have finger pointing. I think both sides need to be solutions oriented. I do think I do worry about China and their mobilization and allocation of resources, and how, as you know, their governmental system can do that much faster than a Western bureaucracy, Western democracy can mobilize and allocate resources. And I fundamentally believe the United States and the West, our allies, NATO, we need to be moving farther ahead, faster. I think about World War II. The Germans discovered nuclear fission was possible December 1938. In 1940s, we started mobilizing against the Manhattan Project. $30 billion later, and 4 years later, obviously, we launched the atomic bomb and set the world order for the next 80 years. My concern is that China, right, that nuclear fission moment has already happened, right? I would claim we were flying AI-piloted drones in 2018 inside buildings without GPS, without communications, without people. We were flying F-16s in 2022 without people, fully AI-piloted drones. And if China, right, has their wits about them and says, great, let's mobilize our resources, let's allocate our resources to this problem, right? That's what I worry about, the U.S. not moving fast enough on a technology that is going to set the world order for the next 80 years. Not just the U.S., the West, right, including NATO as our allies.
Well, and that's sort of a challenge. NATO operates on unanimity, right? How do you get 32 allies in the room to agree on common approach here?
I don't think you can get all 32 to say this is exactly what we need to do, but there needs to be high-level buy-in and people can appoint, right, a leader to lead in this space and say, look, we're going to supercharge efforts here. We all agree that's important for the West to lead in AI and autonomy. We believe in Western values. That's what brings all of us together in this room, and believe in a world that is led by Western values versus a world that is led by a value system that is, that I think we all have challenges with. That's how I think you can mobilize it, right? We've done it in the past. In World War II, we did it. It's not an impossible thing to do. It is challenging, but you have to find, and every country has to realize the importance of it and say, you know what, let's move forward on this.
Ajiti, I know we sort of touched on it with the Replicator initiative a little bit, but I'm just curious, as Ukraine has overshadowed, of course, this whole conference already with the horrible attack that we saw earlier today. I'm curious, with the changes in the battlefield that we see on Ukraine just happening so rapidly from week to week, month to month even, how is the change in that ecosystem impacting the overall innovation ecosystem that you're looking at?
So I think it's putting more definition on the problems that we're trying to solve. As I mentioned earlier, one of the learnings is that we need to stay ahead of the tech curve, and things shift in terms of the environment and the way that it's contested very quickly. So how do we stay ahead of that, not only from a tech perspective, but from an acquisition perspective? I think the cost curves are remarkably low for some of our adversaries. So going back to your earlier questions of things that worry me about China and Russia. So when we're going up against capabilities that are in the tens of thousands of dollars, and we've got some of these systems that are many multiples of that, that's just not a favorable equation for us to sustain, right? And so how do we drive towards those types of solutions? And then how do we look just beyond our own tech ecosystem to work with allies and partners and work with Ukraine? How do we build up their tech ecosystem, because they will need to have these capabilities domestically to sustain their own efforts? Those are all problems that have crystallized through the course of this conflict that we're now really focused on.
Well, and then how do you solve the people problem too? Because it seems like the Ukrainians have been very successful putting IT specialists right into military units. Is that a model that the U.S. could be thinking about?
Yeah, to broaden that framing a little bit, how do you make sure that you're getting feedback real time from the warfighter back into the acquisition system through whatever mechanism?
Yeah. Well, Andrea, anything else that you're looking for at this NATO summit? Brandon, anything that you guys are looking for that could speed up the innovation trajectory within the alliance here?
Well, I think we talked about it. I think faster adoption, more streamlined procurement is really what I'm hoping that is going to be on the table for this summit.
Brandon?
I would echo that. You'll never hear me not saying slow down. Always faster, faster, faster. And I think people need to have that sense of urgency. People have to create that sense of urgency. What matters is, what's going on right now, right? If you are already in an active conflict like Ukraine, Russia, you're coming from behind. And so when I think about NATO in Europe, when I think about the Indo-Pacific, what matters is what you do in peacetime. What matters is the capabilities that you build, because you don't want to be building those capabilities during wartime. It's a 10x harder problem to do. It's much rather solve that problem before it becomes a problem.
Well, let's see how it goes this week. Thanks so much to the panel for a wonderful discussion. Thank you.
And now, please welcome to the stage the Republic of Lithuania's Minister of National Defense, Laurynas Kasčiūnas, and Ambassador of Romania to the United States, Andrei Muraru, for a conversation with the Vice Chairman and CEO of the Munich Security Conference, Dr. Benedikt Franke, on international alliances and modern defense.
Hello everyone, good afternoon. You're almost through with this event. One panel to go, it's us, ending with a bang. We've been given a whooping 20 minutes to discuss how to secure the future. So we'll not lose a second of that future and launch right in. One of the key consequences of the Russian invasion of Ukraine was a pretty obvious shift of the center of gravity in Europe to the east. Leadership of Europe, and to a certain extent of NATO, has moved from European powers like France and Germany to the Lithuanias and Romanias of this world. So I'm thrilled to be here with two good friends. And let me begin by asking you, why is that? Why have you been so vocal? Why have you become drivers within NATO? Is that just because you're so much closer to the front lines, or is there anything else at play? Please.
Hello, everyone. Nice to be here. I think it's three things, 3 points. First of all, of course, perception of Russia. If you look, just a decade ago, we had a big discussion on Nord Stream, and we Lithuanians, Baltics, Polish, saying all the time, look, it's not working with Russia. You need to contain, you need to be from a strong position. If you are from a strong position, you can have a peace. It's a peace through strength, Ronald Reagan concept. And we heard different arguments. If we will have a trade, it will create interdependency, Russia will not go to a war, and so on. And it braked. I mean, we were on the side of the truth. And I think the perception of Russia started to dominate now. So that's why it's one factor of moving to our region. Second thing is, of course, defense spending. If you look at all our countries, what we are doing now, Estonia 3%, Latvia 3%, Lithuania from the last week 3%, Poland, 4% ambitious. Wow, what we are doing now in their purchasing. So it's a big thing. Romania doing very well. Patriot system, everything, which was unknown for our region. So I think it's also very important. Third is support to Ukraine. Lithuania and our countries, Baltic countries, signed the agreement with Ukraine for several years to support at least for 0.25 of GDP annually. So it means if you collect all NATO countries on 0.25, you have more than Russia gives the money, resources to the war in Ukraine. So it's also some kind of leadership showing what we are treating the existential threats. But I will not underestimate, for example, what we are center of gravity. If you look on NATO defense plans, German's factor, US factor is still vital. It's a vital thing. And Germany, with Zeitenwende, with Pistorius' leadership, is moving forward. And for us, it's a crucial thing. German brigade in Lithuania, which we are working on now, it's a big thing. I mean, it's a big deterrence factor. So it's like I can see some moves. Yeah, I agree with you, but still it's not so simple. I mean, Germany and absolutely United States presence in Europe is an existence factor for free and secure Europe.
You've just earned 5 extra points for mentioning Zeitenwende. The Munich Security Conference is the copyright holder of that term.
Oh.
So thanks for that. How about Romania, Andre?
First of all, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here. It's a great privilege and an honor to be here. So I would say that we both celebrate, so Romania and Lithuania, 20 years since we are part of NATO this year. So we are not anymore the children, the NATO children, but we became adults. So we've started to speak openly about.
You've just left college, I guess.
Exactly. We started to speak openly about our needs. I remember in 2015 when Romania, together with Poland, we've created an initiative called B9 Forum, so Bucharest 9. So all the 9 countries from the eastern flank of NATO, you know, we meet from time to time, you know, to discuss about which are our needs. And Romania, of course, since the very beginning was together with Ukraine, and we will be together with Ukraine, and we will support Ukraine as long as it takes, because we share the longest border with Ukraine of any NATO EU members. So the existential threat coming from Russia to NATO is something that nobody expected, you know, before 2021. So we strongly believe that it's our mission, you know, to defend the eastern flank, and of course Romania has started to invest 2% from its GDP in defense after Russia illegally occupied Crimea in 2014. But more than that, we started to invest 2.5% starting this year from our GDP in defense. We've purchased a lot of weapons, you know, Patriot. We just donated a Patriot system to Ukraine a few weeks ago, and we have ordered F-35. You know, we have F-16 HIMARS, the first country in Europe that ordered HIMARS, and we strongly believe it's our mission to invest more. And of course, leading in terms of contributions, but in the same time, we build Rammstein of the East, so a very large base at the Black Sea shore, you know, to be ready, you know, to defend our country and our nation. And Romania has experienced 14 Russian invasions in the last 150 years, Romania and Romanian territories, the last one being in the 40s. So we know very well the only way, you know, to discourage Russia is, you know, to invest a lot in your capabilities. And, of course, strengthening deterrence and defense on the NATO side, ensuring the NATO presence at the brigade level and regional plans that quickly meet the need. Industrial base is something really important to us. And I strongly believe that NATO will be in a very good position in the coming years. And we have to reinforce this industrial base. You know, it's going to take some time, but we are ready. And we see a large cooperation, a large opportunity for cooperation between NATO and EU here, you know. And I'm pretty sure, you know, all the NATO countries, they have together like more than 1 billion people now, you know. If you compare Russia with NATO when it comes about weapons and ammunition and facilities, it's 10 to 1, you know, when it comes about, I mean, in the favor of NATO. So I'm pretty sure that Ukraine can win this war. And of course, it's critical and it's urgent to win this war because it's about our security, our freedom. You know, as I told you, so Romania is the country that shares the longest border with Ukraine and of any NATO EU members.
See, so our speaker's briefing and probably the documents that you had said we should talk about the Lithuanian-Romanian alliance. We are not going to do that, I'm sorry, foreign policy, because you both agreed the alliance is great, the relationships are wonderful. Let's talk about the alliance at large. And let's begin by, you having now been there for 20 years. What do you think it's going to look like in the next 20? Will Ukraine be a member?
First of all, I would say what we have some change in the thinking of alliance and then planning. We went from a deterrence by punishment concept to deterrence by denial. So it means we're a little back to Cold War thinking to have more troops on the line for deterrence, of course. Deterrence as a main factor, if it's needed to defend the NATO country. So I think it's a crucial change. And our new defense plans are based not only on what we have in hands, and according to it we make a plan, but to make a plan which hires expectations from all NATO countries to move forward with capabilities and to fill the gaps. So I think it's a very, very important. We still have many gaps. Air defense, long strike capabilities, and we need to fill. It's so-called targeting gaps. So you know a picture of what you need, and you need to invest. And that's why I can say that 2% is already yesterday. 2.5%, it's a good thing to talk now as a minimum or floor. Even for us, we are already thinking about more than 3%, I would say. It's reality. If you want to fill the gaps, it's reality. If you look at Russia, what they are doing, they are establishing themselves much more faster than we expected. I will give you an example where they produce the ammunition 152, we 155, they 152. So before the full-scale war, they produced 400,000 rounds. Now, in 2 years, in the sanctions, in the isolation, so they produce 2 million rounds per year. So you see, it's a war economy. If you want to adequately react to it, to counterweight it, you need to move faster, especially industrial base. On Ukraine, our countries are on the side of invitation as fast as possible, but it's not easy to agree on that, and it's a reality. The problem here is what we are sending the signal to Russia, what they can have the informal veto power on NATO enlargement, and it's not good. It's not working. We should think about that.
I remember the NATO summit in Bucharest in 2008, when we fully agreed that Ukraine and Georgia, have to be part of NATO, and it never happened. But what we see right now is a bunch of defense treaties being signed between Ukraine and a number of countries, including the United States, the European Union, and other countries. And this is really important because this might create another reality that comparing with what happened, when the invasion started. Then, of course, the most important thing to be part of NATO is you have the security guarantees and you are under the protection of Article 5. But for Ukraine now is essential to receive weapons and ammunition. It's critical, to defeat Russia in Ukraine. And if that is going to take place, we could speak about another reality. So a reality in which one of the strongest armies in the world, I'm speaking about Ukraine, of course, is going to be part of NATO. So I'm pretty sure that Mr. Putin will fight until the very end not to let Ukraine to be part of NATO, but we would like to assure Mr. Putin that we will stay together with Ukraine, until Russia is going to be defeated in Ukraine.
Thank you. You mentioned the 2% debate, the 2.5% debate in Germany. We currently have the 2.014 debate. Very happy about that at the moment. But when I travel through the United States, I have a feeling that the 2% debate is so 2022-ish. And it's really about resilience, that the next US administration, whoever it may be, will push Europe to do more on resilience. You Americans do a hell of a lot on resilience. We do not yet enough in their view. Lithuania has a very particular experience with resilience in China. What do you think the role of NATO versus China is? We've had a panel with Elbridge Kobe here earlier today, where he said, the US should do less within NATO and let the Europeans worry about Europe and do more on the Indo-Pacific, and we shouldn't change the mission statement of NATO to look in that direction. Any views on that from Lithuania?
Just a few words on 2%. If you count all EU, NATO countries, already today it's a 2% average. So with Germany 2%, we came all as an average 2%, so it's a celebration day. So 23 members of NATO now is more than 2% from 32. So it's some move. Of course, not revolutionary, but evolutionary. On China, I will be frank and realistic. It will be very hard to agree. It will be very hard to agree. Lithuania, look at what we don't have any Chinese investment into our critical infrastructure. I personally led the law which banned Chinese telecommunication companies joining the 5G development in Lithuania. We tried to get to our ports, we banned. So we have no big influence. When we opened the Taiwanese representation in Lithuania, we were harassed, we were pressured, and we survived because of our independence from China. But it's Lithuanian model. Maybe Czech Republic could be an example. Other countries, there are some different, approaches. I mean, there are countries in Europe who are saying we want to be a Chinese hub in Europe. So that's why, in this context, to find a common approach on China, especially in the EU, it's hard. It's hard. So it's many things to do.
Romania's view on resilience.
Yeah. So we strongly believe that critical infrastructure, is needed to be protected, and this is why, of course, China is a very great. It's a great player. China, has a lot of influence, but Romania took a very courageous decisions in the past years, with a broad political consensus, is to protect our critical infrastructure and to not allow, different companies, to get in. Romania was the first country in the world signing an MOU with the United States on 5G. In 2019, during Trump administration, Romania took a very serious decision, to cut off with the Chinese company to build our another two nuclear reactors, and we took also a very courageous decision, to protect our infrastructure projects. So this is something that we really care. And despite of fact we have a good relationship with China, and we respect one China policy, that this is really important to protect our infrastructure and to work only with like-minded partners.
Let's end on narratives. In Germany, our population is split virtually down the middle. 50% think NATO is the best thing ever invented. 50% think it's an unnecessary tool of aggression. How has the narrative in your countries changed over the last 2 years? Is the pendulum swimming one way or the other?
90% of Lithuanians supports membership in NATO, so it's the highest result historically. We have this project now with Germany on German brigade. People were asked, do you support? 88% support German's permanent presence in Lithuania. So it's not about NATO and not about security guarantees. Maybe there are some narratives which competes, but at small scale. It's how, if you making yourself stronger, buying more equipment, is it a way to the peace or it's escalation? This is what Russia is doing. if you give weapons, you remember, give weapons to Ukraine, it will be escalation. No, it will deter. So this is the problem. Deterrence or escalation. Sometimes it's Russian narrative hits, but not about security guarantees or NATO membership.
Is the same true for Romania?
Yeah, according to all the polls we've conducted in the last years, so NATO support is by far, the highest we have ever seen since our integration into NATO. The support for having American military presence in Romania is also very high, which is very interesting because, to answer to a question, if you agree to have American military bases on your soil, that means you agree, that is a risk to be attacked because of that. So, and people there, they really understand what's going on. And more than that, we see the lowest support when it comes about having a good relationship with Russia, in spite of the fact it was not really large in the past. We see. So what's interesting is that for the first time, we see in the past 20 years, an extremist party getting into the Romanian parliament and, getting into the European Parliament, but that support has something to do with the crisis we went through. I mean, COVID and 19 and inflation and the energy crisis. So we don't see people being very eager to support the business as usual relationship with Russia. But we have a lot of malign campaigns, and disinformation and fake news campaigns, in Romania being supported by Russia. And we're pretty sure that we're gonna live with this threat for many years, in the coming years.
Perfect. Being a conference organizer myself, I know that if that red light is on, we've reached the end of our allotted time. Thank you very much for the last 20 minutes. Good luck for the next 2 days here at the NATO Summit.
Thank you.
Thank you all for listening.
Thank you.
Please welcome back to the stage FP's Ravi Agrawal.
Okay, thank you, Benedict, then. A really good panel of guests. We're at our close, and you've made it through the second of 2 FP events today. Honestly, congratulations to you. Thank you to you for being here, for spending time with us, for listening to all of these conversations that I think really kick things off in the right way this week, as we've got so many more world leaders coming in over the course of the next few days, building on many of the discussions we've just had here today. None of this would have been possible without our sponsors, and so I do want to thank the Council of Strategic Risks, Lockheed Martin, Microsoft, and the NATO Innovation Fund. A couple of other things. If you enjoyed this event, we do many more events like this around the world. We're often at Davos and Munich holding discussions and convenings and dinners. Our next big one is going to be at UNGA in September, where we'll be hosting a number of public events. It's in New York, but if you're going to be there, do look us up. There'll be a similar set of very important discussions around the UNGA agenda, and I'm sure world news that will crop up. Also, subscribe to FP. You've heard us say that before, but we can't do what we do without your support and subscriptions. Many of you are already readers. I know some of you are writers as well. but do keep subscribing and supporting us. I'm Ravi Agarwal. None of this would have been possible. Obviously, I mentioned our partners and supporters, but also our events team, which does fantastic work throughout the year. It's very hard work behind the scenes, but they're a terrific team, and I'm sure you've seen some of them bobbing in and about. So thank you for coming. Have a great week at NATO Week, and we will see you somewhere else very soon. Cheers.